I needed $20,000 for an emergency cancer surgery. When I called my highly successful son, he laughed. He said his firm just closed a $15 million deal, that my surgery was a terrible return on investment, and there was no money for me. Hours later, my estranged daughter, a single mother drowning in debt, showed up at my door in the pouring rain. She shoved an envelope containing $17,000 into my chest. That single moment of agonizing sacrifice changed absolutely everything. It forced me to unleash a silent, devastating reckoning. Days later, my son showed up at my hospital bed, furious, unaware that he was stepping directly into a trap that would cost him his freedom. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who saw your kindness as a weakness. The air in Dr. Mercer's office smelled of bleach and impending doom. He slapped the translucent biopsy scan against the glowing light board. The stark white mass was wrapped like a venomous snake around my renal artery. Mercer did not offer empty comfort. He was a surgical oncologist who dealt in harsh realities, and his words cut straight through the clinical silence. Standard protocol demands we wait 6 weeks for insurance clearance, Mercer said, his voice completely flat. But this tumor is aggressive. In 6 weeks, we will not be talking about surgery. We will be talking about hospice. I stared at the illuminated mass on the board. My chest tightened not just from the fear of death, but from the terrifying logistics of survival. Mercer turned from the board to face me directly. There is an experimental robotic excision I can perform in 48 hours. It bypasses the waiting period entirely. It will save your life. But the hospital administration requires a $20,000 out-of-pocket deposit by tomorrow morning. I nodded immediately, swallowing the lump in my throat. Yes, I told him. Do it. But internally, a cold, suffocating panic began to spread through my veins. Mercer handed me the heavy stack of billing paperwork and walked out to schedule the operating room. I remained sitting on the crinkling paper of the examination table, trapped in a nightmare paradox of my own making. I was not a poor man. I had spent 40 years working as a civil engineer, quietly building a commercial logistics portfolio that was currently valued at over $8 million. But I lived in a modest suburban home, drove a rusted sedan, and wore faded clothes. I lived this way because of my son, Nicholas. Years ago, Nicholas began bleeding my accounts dry to fund his endless, reckless corporate leverage schemes. He viewed my wealth as his personal casino. To protect the legacy I had built for my grandchildren, I transferred every cent I owned into an irrevocable blind trust managed by my ruthless wealth manager, Gordon Blake. The trust was ironclad. It kept my fortune entirely invisible and completely untouchable by my son. But that ultimate security came with a fatal flaw. To prevent Nicholas from coercing me into an impulsive withdrawal, Gordon and I had engineered a strict 30-day legal notice period to unfreeze any liquid assets. I needed $20,000 by tomorrow morning. If I triggered an emergency breach of the trust to get the cash, it would launch a mandatory financial audit across all my holdings. Nicholas would instantly be alerted to the millions I had hidden from him. He would descend upon me like a starving vulture, demanding control of the estate while I was incapacitated on a hospital operating table. I could not touch my own money. I had to find cash immediately without triggering the alarms. The hospital parking lot was suffocatingly hot as I walked to my rusted 2011 sedan. Every step sent a sharp, agonizing spike of pain through my lower back, a brutal physical reminder of the mass growing inside me. I sat heavily behind the steering wheel, my hands trembling as I gripped the worn leather. I pulled out my phone. There was only one person I could ask for a bridge loan. Nicholas. He was a commercial property developer, a man obsessed with his corporate image and his wealth. I dialed his number, praying for a moment of genuine connection. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. A chaotic wave of background noise immediately flooded the car interior. I could hear the sharp clinking of crystal glasses, loud jazz music playing from expensive speakers, and the booming, arrogant laughter of corporate executives. "Dad." "I cannot talk right now," Nicholas shouted over the noise, his tone dripping with irritation. "We are popping a $5,000 bottle of champagne. We just closed the acquisition on the downtown commercial complex. $15 million, Dad. 15 million. His voice was filled with triumph, completely devoid of any interest in why I was calling in the middle of the workday. "Nicholas, I need you to step away from the party," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the piercing pain radiating through my side. "This is a medical emergency." The jazz music muffled slightly as he clearly walked down a hallway, profoundly annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Dad?" "I am in the middle of a massive celebration. Diana is waiting for me." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "I was just at Dr. Mercer's office," I explained, my voice tight with fear. "The biopsy came back. It is an aggressive tumor on my renal artery. I need a robotic excision in 48 hours or I am not going to make it." There was a brief silence on the line. I waited for the panic of a son hearing his father was dying. I waited for a gasp, an urgent question, any sign of human empathy. Instead, I heard a heavy, irritated sigh. "Okay," Nicholas said slowly, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "What does the insurance say?" "They cannot clear it for 6 weeks," I replied, my voice shaking. "That is too late. The hospital needs a $20,000 out-of-pocket deposit by tomorrow morning. I need a 30-day loan, Nicholas. Just $20,000. I will pay you back in exactly 1 month. I promise you." The silence that followed was agonizing. It stretched on heavy and suffocating in the heat of the car. The faint sound of the jazz music echoed through the receiver. Then Nicholas spoke and his voice dropped. It was no longer the voice of a son speaking to his father. It was the chilling, calculated whisper of a ruthless businessman evaluating an expiring asset. "You are 72 years old, Dad." Nicholas said, his words slicing through the phone like a scalpel. "An experimental surgery at your age is a terrible return on investment." I felt the air leave my lungs. A terrible return on investment. "I am your father," I whispered, staring blindly at the dashboard. Nicholas scoffed a short, cruel sound. "And I am a businessman who just closed a $15 million deal. Do you know what that means?" "It means my liquidity is entirely tied up in escrow. Every single dime is locked in collateral. I do not have 20 grand in cash sitting around to throw at a sinking ship." The sheer cruelty of his words paralyzed me. I thought of the countless double shifts I had worked at the engineering firm when his mother was sick. I thought of the nights I slept in my truck just so I could pay the exorbitant tuition for his elite university degree without taking out loans that would burden his future. "I paid for your education with my blood and sweat," I said, my voice rising with the desperate, helpless anger. "You are celebrating a $15 million deal, and you cannot spare $20,000 to save my life." I heard movement on the line. Diana, his calculating, materialistic wife, must have approached him in the hallway. I could hear her sharp, venomous voice bleeding through the background. "Tell him we are not a charity, Nicholas. Tell him to use his Medicare." Nicholas cleared his throat, emboldened by her callous presence. "Look, Dad, you need to accept reality. You have lived a long life. Stop being selfish and asking me to jeopardize my corporate future for a medical Hail Mary. There is no money for you." The call disconnected. A sharp click followed by the dead ringing dial tone. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. My own son had just handed me a death sentence so he could keep his escrow accounts perfectly balanced. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just a refusal of money. It was a complete, calculated erasure of my value as a human being. I sat in the stifling heat of the car, entirely devoid of options. I had less than 24 hours to find the cash or the tumor would claim my life. I drove home in a daze, the physical pain in my side radiating outward, matched only by the crushing psychological weight in my chest. I pulled into the driveway of my modest home. The house was dark and completely silent, a stark contrast to the life it once held. I walked into the living room and turned on a single lamp. The medical paperwork lay in my hand, heavy with the demand for $20,000. I walked into my bedroom and opened the small wooden jewelry box on my dresser. I pulled out my late wife's wedding ring. The diamond caught the dim light. It was the only thing I had left of her. I squeezed it tightly in my palm. Next, I walked down to the basement, turning on the harsh fluorescent overhead lights. I looked at my vintage woodworking tools. The heavy lathes, the custom saws, the precision instruments I had collected over 40 years. With my analytical engineering mind, I quickly calculated their pawn value. The tools would bring in maybe $5,000. The ring might bring $8,000. It was not enough. I was still thousands of dollars short, and the pawn shops would not open until dawn. I sat heavily on the bottom of the basement stairs, the cold concrete seeping into my bones. The silence pressed in on me, loud and unforgiving. I was a man with $8 million hidden away in an ironclad trust, preparing to sell my dead wife's wedding ring just to buy a few more months of life, all because my son decided I was a bad investment. Suddenly, the sharp, frantic ringing of the doorbell shattered the quiet. I flinched. The rain had started outside, drumming heavily against the small basement windows. I slowly climbed the stairs, every movement a brutal battle against the searing pain in my abdomen. I approached the front door and pulled it open. Standing on my porch, soaked to the bone by the driving rain, was my estranged daughter, Valerie. I had not seen her in months. She was a struggling single mother, fighting desperately to keep her small floral shop from bankruptcy after her husband abandoned them. She clutched a heavy waterlogged manila envelope tightly against her chest, her shoulders heaving as she gasped for air in the cold rain. The frantic ringing of the doorbell pierced the heavy silence of the house. Harold stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, his hand gripping the wooden railing, as another sharp spasm of pain radiated from his abdomen. Every chime of the bell felt like a hammer against his ribs. He forced himself up the steps, his breath hitching, fully expecting to find a pawnbroker, or perhaps a loan shark, at the door. He swung the front door open to the driving rain. Standing on the porch, completely soaked and shivering violently, was Valerie. Harold stared at his daughter. Her wet hair clung to her face and her thin raincoat was completely saturated. She did not say hello. She did not ask how he was feeling. She pushed past him into the hallway, her boots squeaking against the hardwood floor. She was clutching a thick, waterlogged manila envelope against her chest, as if her life depended on it. "Valerie, what are you doing here in this storm?" Harold asked, closing the door against the howling wind. She did not answer. She marched directly into the kitchen and stopped at the worn wooden table. Her hands were shaking, uncontrollably stained with the faint purple and green dyes of crushed flower stems. She slammed the envelope onto the table. Harold approached slowly, leaning heavily against the counter to steady himself. The pain in his side flared again, but the sight before him commanded his complete attention. Valerie ripped the top of the envelope open and dumped the contents. Banded stacks of worn $20 and $50 bills cascaded across the wood, followed by a crumpled cashier's check. "What is this?" Harold whispered, staring at the chaotic pile of money. "That is $17,000, Valerie said, her voice entirely devoid of breath, but thick with a desperate, unyielding, absolute resolve. "You need $20,000 by tomorrow morning. I am $3,000 short, but I brought everything I could liquidate today. The hospital will have to accept a payment plan for the rest. I will co-sign whatever they want." Harold felt the floor vanish beneath him. His mind, trained for decades in civil engineering, immediately processed the impossibility of the sum. Valerie was a single mother. Since her husband walked out 3 years ago, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debt, she had been fighting a brutal losing war to keep her small floral shop from going completely under. She lived paycheck to paycheck, skipping her own meals to make sure her son had lunch for school. She did not have $17,000 to spare. She barely had $17. How do you know about the hospital deposit? Harold asked, his voice tightening. I did not tell you. Valerie let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. You did not tell me because you knew I would do exactly this. You called Nicholas, didn't you? You called my arrogant, perfectly tailored brother and asked him for help. And let me guess. He told you he was completely tied up. He told you your life was not worth liquidating his precious investments. Harold looked away, the shame of his son's betrayal burning in his throat. You haven't spoken to Nicholas in 4 years, Harold murmured. I don't need to speak to him to know exactly how his toxic elitism operates. Valerie shot back, her eyes flashing with sudden fury. I know how he looks at you, Dad. He looks at you like you are an expired contract. But you did not answer my question. How did you find out about the surgery? Dr. Mercer's front desk receptionist comes into my shop every Friday to buy leftover lilies for the waiting room, Valerie said, stepping closer to the table. She came in this afternoon, crying. She told me she saw your file. She told me the tumor is wrapping around your renal artery and that you were denied the standard insurance timeline. She broke federal privacy laws to tell me that my father was going to die because he did not have the cash for an experimental robotic procedure. Valerie leaned over the table, placing her stained, shaking hands flat against the wood. You were going to sit in this dark house and let the cancer kill you, just to avoid being a burden. Valerie, I cannot take this money. Harold said, his voice trembling. He reached out to push the cash back toward her, but she aggressively shoved his hand away. You are going to take every single cent, Valerie demanded, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. Where did you get this? Harold asked, his eyes scanning the crumpled cashier's check. The name of the bank printed on the top corner made his stomach churn. That is the credit union where you set up your son's college fund. Valerie did not flinch. I drained it. I drained the college fund. I sold the commercial delivery van for the shop to a scrapyard 2 hours ago. I pawned the industrial coolers. I brought you everything I have. You ruined your business, Harold whispered, the sheer horror of her sacrifice crushing the breath out of his lungs. Valerie, you need that van to make your deliveries. You need those coolers to keep your inventory alive. If you give me this money, your shop will go into foreclosure by the end of the month. You and my grandson will be out on the street. I am 72 years old. I have lived my life. I will not let you destroy yours for me. Valerie grabbed the collar of his shirt, pulling him forward until they were inches apart. Her eyes were red-lined with exhaustion and absolute terror, but her grip was like iron. You listened to me, she hissed through her teeth. When Mom died, you worked double shifts at the firm. You wore shoes with holes in the soles for 3 years just so you could afford my braces. You skipped your own dinners so Nicholas and I could have full plates. Do you think I forgot that? Do you think I am like him? Harold tried to speak, but the immense suffocating guilt choked him. He possessed a hidden fortune of $8 million. It was locked in a blind trust, totally inaccessible for 30 days, without alerting Nicholas to its existence. His fierce desire to protect his wealth from his greedy son had directly forced his struggling daughter into complete financial ruin. He had created this nightmare. I will not bury you because Nicholas wants a higher profit margin this quarter, Valerie said, stepping back and pointing a shaking finger at the scattered cash. You are going to take this money. You are going to drive to the hospital right now, and you are going to pay that deposit. You are going to let them cut that tumor out of your body, and you are going to survive. Do you understand me? Harold stared at the worn banded bills on the table. They represented the death of his daughter's dream, the sacrifice of her last ounce of security, all offered freely to save a father who had secretly hid millions from her. A profound, searing transformation ignited in his chest. The passive, quiet endurance he had maintained for years evaporated in a single heartbeat. He would take her money. He would survive the surgery. But the moment he woke up from the anesthesia, the silence would end. He would tear apart his son's corporate empire brick by brick, and he would repay his daughter's sacrifice 100 times over. I understand, Harold said quietly, gathering the damp bills into his hands. I will sign the papers. Harold looked down at the kitchen table. The worn wood was covered in a chaotic spread of currency. There were rubber bands holding thick stacks of $20 bills, crumpled $50 bills, and a single pristine cashier check resting at the center. His engineering mind, trained to calculate structural loads and material costs for 4 decades, immediately began to process the physical evidence of his daughter's financial ruin. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the damp paper. The pain in his abdomen flared violently, a sharp twisting agony that radiated through his spine, but he forced himself to breathe through it. He picked up the cashier check. The logo of the local community credit union was printed across the top in faded blue ink. It was made out for exactly $12,000. Pinned beneath it was a withdrawal receipt. He read the account name printed in dot matrix ink. It was the custodial savings account Valerie had opened the day her son was born. She had deposited $50 a month into that account for 10 years, refusing to skip a payment even when her husband walked out and left her drowning in massive credit card debt. That money was meant to be her son's escape route, his chance at a university degree away from this struggling neighborhood. It was completely gone. The balance on the receipt read 0. Harold dropped the check as his breathing grew shallow and labored. He looked at the stacks of banded cash. Next to them lay a carbon copy printout from a commercial title loan company operating on the dangerous edge of the city. He pulled the yellow slip toward him. The vehicle identification number listed on the pawn slip belonged to the refrigerated delivery van Valerie used for her floral shop. It was the only vehicle she owned that could safely transport large wedding orders across town. It was the single asset keeping her fragile business afloat. She had pawned the title for $5,000 at an exorbitant interest rate. Without that van, she could not fulfill her lucrative weekend contracts. Without those contracts, she would default on her commercial lease before the end of the month. She had systematically dismantled her entire future in the span of 3 hours just to bring him this pile of paper. The total amount sitting on his table was exactly $17,000. I cannot take this, Harold said. His voice was a raw, fractured whisper. He pushed the heavy stacks of cash back across the table toward her. Valerie, you need that van to run your shop. You need that savings account for your son. If I take this money, you will lose everything. You will be out on the street by the end of the season. I will not allow you to destroy your life for me. Take it back right now. Valerie did not move. Rainwater dripped from her chin onto her worn denim jacket, pooling on the floor beneath her boots. She planted her hands firmly on the edge of the table and leaned forward. The exhaustion in her eyes was entirely overshadowed by a fierce, terrifying resolve. She pushed the money right back to his side of the table. I am not asking for your permission, she said, her voice dropping into a hard, unyielding register. I am telling you what is going to happen. You are going to put this money in your pocket. You are going to let me drive you to the hospital, and you are going to pay that surgeon to cut the cancer out of your body. Harold gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as another wave of pain threatened to buckle his knees. He looked at his daughter, pleading with her through his physical agony. I have lived 72 years, he told her, coughing, as the strain hit his lungs. I have had a full life. You are 34 years old. You have a child who depends on you to keep a roof over his head. Do you understand what happens when you default on that title loan? They will repossess the van by next Friday. Your shop will go into immediate bankruptcy. I absolutely refuse to let my life be the reason you lose yours. Take the money, Valerie. Please. Valerie slammed both of her hands flat against the wooden table. The sudden noise echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Her face flushed with an intense, desperate fury. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the boundary he was desperately trying to set. Do not stand there and lecture me about sacrifice, she yelled, her voice finally breaking as tears mixed with the rain on her face. Do you think I forgot what happened after Mom died? Do you think I did not see what you did? I was 12 years old, Dad. I remember you working 14-hour shifts at the engineering site. I remember you coming home with your hands blistered and bleeding. I remember you sitting at this exact kitchen table, staring at past due mortgage notices, while you let me and my brother eat the only decent food left in the refrigerator. You claimed you were not hungry. You told me you ate a big lunch at the job site. You lied to us. You skipped meals for months so I would not have to go to sleep with an empty stomach. You wore the same frayed winter coat for 10 years so you could buy me a beautiful dress for my high school graduation. You gave up every single piece of your own comfort to make sure I survived. Harold looked away, completely unable to meet her gaze. The weight of her words pressed down on him, suffocating him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I am not going to let you die over a pile of paper. Valerie continued, her tone shifting from fury to a desperate, pleading whisper. Money can be rebuilt. A business can be restarted. But I only have one father. I will not let you walk away from me because you are too proud to let me save you. Sign the hospital admission papers, Dad. Let me do this for you. Just this once, let someone take care of you. Harold stood completely frozen in the dim light of the kitchen. A crushing, unbearable guilt wrapped tightly around his throat. He looked at his daughter, seeing the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed edges of her coat, the sheer terror radiating from her posture. She had sacrificed her entire existence for him, and she had done it while he was secretly sitting on a commercial portfolio worth $8 million. The blind trust he had engineered to protect his wealth from his greedy, corporate-obsessed son had worked entirely too well. His desire to keep his fortune hidden from a predator had forced his innocent, struggling daughter to walk straight into a financial slaughterhouse. He had let her drain her child's future just to maintain his cover. The sheer gravity of his deception made him feel physically sick. If he told her the truth right now, if he confessed that he was a millionaire pretending to be a broke retiree, it would break her heart and completely shatter her trust in him. He could not reveal the trust. He could not trigger the 30-day unfreeze. He needed the surgery tomorrow morning, and her ruined savings were the only immediate currency that could secure his survival. Harold slowly reached out. His hands shook violently as he gathered the crumpled cashier check and the heavy banded stacks of cash. He pulled the money toward his chest, feeling the dampness of the paper against his shirt. He looked into Valerie's tear-filled eyes, swallowing the massive lump of guilt lodged in his throat. Okay, Harold whispered, his voice cracking under the emotional weight. I will take it. I will sign the papers. Valerie let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders collapsing in immense relief. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, completely oblivious to the fact that her father was making a silent, terrifying vow. Harold closed his eyes as he embraced his daughter. He would endure the robotic excision. He would survive the operating table, and the exact moment the anesthesia cleared his system, he would unleash an absolute devastating reckoning upon the son who had forced this nightmare into existence. He would tear down his son's $15 million corporate illusion piece by piece, and he would repay his daughter's sacrifice 100 times over. The morning light was a dull and sickly gray as Harold stood before the thick glass window of the hospital billing department. He slid the damp, heavy stacks of $20 and $50 bills through the metal slot, followed by the crumpled cashier check from the credit union. The admissions clerk did not look up at him. She possessed the bored, mechanical efficiency of someone who processed human desperation every single day. She ran the banded cash through an automated counting machine. The rapid synthetic shuffling of the bills echoed in the sterile corridor. Harold watched his daughter's entire future disappear into a plastic deposit bag. The machine flashed a green light. $17,000 exactly. The clerk stamped a red sequence of numbers onto his admission file and pointed down the hall. Harold did not look back. He had crossed the threshold. The transaction was absolute. The preoperative sequence was completely stripped of any human warmth. It was a factory assembly line designed for the preservation of life. A young nurse directed him to strip off his faded clothes and put on a thin, abrasive hospital gown. The room smelled fiercely of iodine industrial bleach and sterile plastic. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, relentless hum. Dr. Mercer entered the room reading a digital tablet. He did not offer any false platitudes or comforting smiles. He pulled a black marker from his coat pocket and drew a thick, dark line across the right side of Harold's abdomen, mapping the precise trajectory where the robotic surgical arms would penetrate his skin. "The tumor is resting tightly against the arterial wall," Mercer said, his voice completely flat and clinical. "The robotic excision will allow us millimeter precision. You will be under general anesthesia for approximately 4 hours. If the margins are clear, we close. If the mass has attached to the vein, we pivot to an open operation." Harold nodded once. He appreciated the coldness. He did not want sympathy. He needed execution. A technician wheeled in an intravenous cart, expertly finding a vein in the back of Harold's left hand. The initial sting of the needle was nothing compared to the deep, aching pressure radiating from his kidney. Valerie stood silently on the right side of the gurney. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes even more pronounced under the harsh hospital lights, but she did not cry. She reached out and wrapped her hands around his right palm. Her fingers were still faintly stained with the green dye of cut flower stems. The contrast between the clinical, freezing environment of the surgical prep room and the desperate warmth of his daughter's grip anchored him to reality. The anesthesiologist stepped behind the gurney, attaching a clear plastic mask over Harold's nose and mouth. The gas tasted metallic and heavy. "Count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist instructed. Harold looked at Valerie. He did not make it past 8. The sterile white ceiling fractured into dark gray shadows, and then the world dissolved into an absolute suffocating black void. He awoke to a sensation of pure blinding fire. There was no gentle transition back to consciousness. Harold was violently dragged from the dark by the screaming agony in his right side. It felt as though a serrated blade had been buried deep into his abdomen and left there to burn. He tried to take a breath, but his lungs hitched, restricted by a tight, rigid compression binder, wrapped completely around his torso. The rhythmic, high-pitched beeping of an electrocardiogram monitor filled his ears. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead. He forced them open, his vision swimming in a blurry haze of muted lights and moving shadows. The blurry shape at the foot of his bed slowly resolved into the stern, unsmiling face of Dr. Mercer. The surgeon was making notes on a chart, oblivious to Harold's silent struggle to breathe. Mercer looked up, catching Harold's open eyes. The robotic excision was highly successful. Mercer stated, his tone as detached as a mechanic reporting a repaired engine. "The margins are completely clear. We successfully detached the mass from the arterial wall without needing to pivot to an open procedure. You will experience significant post-operative trauma, but the cancer is gone. You are in the intensive care unit. I have ordered a strict pain management protocol. Rest." Mercer turned and walked out of the room, leaving Harold alone in the dim, quiet space. The heavy dose of intravenous painkillers was slowly beginning to dull the sharp edges of the fire in his side, replacing it with a thick, heavy lethargy. He turned his head slightly. The room was empty. Valerie was not in the chair next to the bed. A young nurse had mentioned earlier that visitors were restricted, while patients stabilized, and she had likely gone to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee or to call her son. Harold closed his eyes, preparing to surrender to the heavy pull of the medication. He had survived. The physical battle was over, but the silence of the room was suddenly shattered by a harsh mechanical vibration. It was not the medical equipment. The sound was distinct, muffled but violent, coming from the clear plastic personal effects bag resting on the small rolling table next to his bed. Harold forced his heavy eyes open. His body screamed in protest as he shifted his weight, fighting the paralyzing effects of the drugs. He stretched his left hand toward the table, his fingers grazing the cold plastic. The vibration pulsed again, a frantic, continuous buzzing. He gripped the edge of the bag and pulled it onto his chest, his breathing ragged from the physical exertion. He reached inside and pulled out a cheap prepaid burner phone. This was not his standard mobile device. This was a secure, untraceable phone he used exclusively to monitor the digital security feed of his home. He had installed a highly sophisticated camera network years ago, linking it directly to this hidden device to ensure absolute privacy over his estate. He had specifically instructed his wealth manager, Gordon Blake, never to contact this number unless the blind trust was in imminent catastrophic danger. Harold stared at the glowing screen in the dark hospital room. His vision was swimming from the heavy narcotics, but the bright red notification banners cut straight through the chemical fog. It was not a message from Gordon. It was a silent, automated security alert from his home cameras. Motion detected at front entrance. Motion detected in living room. Motion detected in primary hallway. Harold lay perfectly still, the steady beeping of his heart monitor beginning to accelerate. The digital clock on the burner phone read 2:14 in the afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet during the day. The doors were deadbolted. The windows were locked. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be inside his house. With a trembling thumb, he swiped across the screen, bypassing the security lock, to open the live camera feed. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before resolving into a crystal-clear, high-definition view of his living room. Harold stopped breathing. Standing in the center of his private sanctuary was his son, Nicholas. Nicholas was not dressed in his usual immaculate corporate suit. He was wearing dark jeans and a dark jacket, moving with a frantic, aggressive energy that Harold had never seen before. Behind him, pacing nervously near the hallway corridor, was Diana. She was clutching a large, empty canvas tote bag, her eyes darting toward the front windows as if checking for passing patrol cars. Harold's mind, fighting desperately against the fog of the anesthesia, tried to rationalize the image. Perhaps they had come to pack a bag for him. Perhaps they had felt a sudden pang of guilt after the phone call and decided to visit the hospital. But the brutal reality unfolding on the small screen immediately destroyed that illusion. Nicholas was not looking for clothes. He was not looking for a toothbrush or a pair of slippers. Nicholas was holding a heavy steel pry bar. Harold watched in absolute paralyzing silence as his son walked directly toward the locked heavy metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. It was the cabinet where Harold kept his oldest tax returns, his utility bills, and his obsolete property deeds. Nicholas raised the pry bar, jammed the angled steel edge beneath the lock mechanism, and violently threw his entire body weight against the handle. The metal cabinet screeched in protest. Nicholas hit it again, his face twisted in a desperate, ugly snarl. The lock snapped. The drawers slid open. Diana rushed forward, dropping the canvas bag onto the floor. The two of them began frantically tearing through the files, ripping manila folders apart, dumping decades of Harold's personal history onto the carpet. They were hunting for something specific. They were desperate. The pain medication pulsing through Harold's veins suddenly felt completely useless against the icy, terrifying realization gripping his chest. His son had just closed a $15 million commercial acquisition. He had literally laughed at the idea of sparing $20,000 just 24 hours ago. Why was a man flush with millions of dollars in corporate capital desperately breaking into a modest suburban home with a pry bar? Why was he destroying his dying father's property? Harold squeezed the burner phone until the plastic casing groaned under the pressure. The cancer was gone, but the true disease had just broken into his house. The silent reckoning had begun. The harsh glow of the small cellular screen illuminated the dark hospital room. Harold lay completely frozen against the stiff cotton sheets. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to fade into a distant echo as all of his attention became entirely anchored to the silent video feed playing in the palm of his hand. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The heavy narcotics pumped into his veins were fighting a losing battle against the pure adrenaline now flooding his system. He watched the scene unfold with the detached and clinical precision of a civil engineer analyzing a catastrophic structural failure. On the screen, his son Nicholas raised the heavy steel pry bar again. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure frantic desperation. Sweat stained the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. Nicholas slammed the metal bar down against the reinforced locking mechanism of the filing cabinet. The metal buckled and warped under the brutal force. Harold felt the physical impact of that blow reverberating through his own shattered abdomen. This was not a casual visit to collect clothes for a recovering father. This was a violently calculated home invasion committed by his own flesh and blood. Diana moved rapidly into the frame of the camera. Her usual polished and arrogant demeanor was entirely gone. She dropped her designer purse onto the worn living room carpet and fell to her knees next to the ruined cabinet. She began ripping handfuls of manila folders from the bottom drawer. She threw decades of Harold's personal history onto the floor like worthless trash. Old utility bills and obsolete insurance policies fluttered through the air. She was hunting for something very specific. Her lips were moving rapidly as she shouted instructions to Nicholas. Although the security feed lacked audio, Harold could easily read the frantic panic in her posture. She was looking for the property deeds. She was looking for the legal documentation that proved Harold owned the house and the surrounding land outright. Harold lowered the phone slightly and let his heavy head sink deep into the hospital pillow. His brilliant analytical mind immediately began to dissect the monumental contradiction playing out before his eyes. He recalled the phone call from the hospital parking lot just 24 hours ago. He remembered the loud jazz music and the sound of clinking crystal glasses. Nicholas had explicitly boasted about popping a vintage bottle of champagne to celebrate closing a massive $15 million commercial real estate acquisition. His son had proudly declared that his massive wealth was entirely tied up in corporate escrow accounts. He had used that exact excuse to deny Harold the $20,000 needed to save his life. But the violent scene on the glowing screen completely destroyed that narrative. A man who just successfully closed a $15 million corporate deal does not sweat through his luxury clothing while committing a felony burglary in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A wealthy commercial property developer does not use a crowbar to pry open a cheap metal cabinet in his dying father's living room. That specific breed of violence belonged to a desperate and cornered animal. It was the frantic behavior of a man who was drowning and grasping at anything to keep his head above water. Nicholas was completely bankrupt. The realization hit Harold with the force of a speeding freight train. The entire corporate empire his son constantly flaunted was nothing but a hollow shell. Nicholas had not refused the $20,000 out of simple spite or casual cruelty. He had refused the money because he literally did not have it. The $15 million deal was real, but Nicholas was not buying it with his own capital. He was trying to leverage it. To secure that kind of massive corporate leverage, a bank would require an ironclad physical asset as collateral. Harold raised the phone back to his tired eyes. He watched Diana finally pull a thick red folder from the back of the bottom drawer. She let out a visible gasp of triumph and held it up for Nicholas to see. It was the legacy property file. It contained the original deeds to the house and the adjacent land that Harold had purchased 40 years ago. Nicholas grabbed the folder from his wife's hands. The relief washing over his son's face was absolutely sickening. Nicholas clutched the stolen documents to his chest and grabbed Diana by the arm. The two of them sprinted out of the camera frame toward the front door. The video feed went completely still. The living room was empty once again, leaving only the chaotic mess of shredded papers and the destroyed metal cabinet behind. Harold locked the screen and let the phone slip from his fingers onto the hospital blanket. The searing physical pain of the surgical incisions across his abdomen was entirely eclipsed by the magnitude of his son's betrayal. Nicholas had needed the property deeds to secure his fraudulent commercial loan. But a bank would never accept those deeds as collateral unless the primary owner signed the authorization papers. Harold had never signed anything. Therefore, Nicholas was planning to forge his signature. The puzzle pieces locked together with a terrifying clarity. Nicholas had known the experimental robotic surgery was a matter of life and death. If Harold died from the aggressive cancer, the house would naturally pass to his next of kin. Nicholas could forge whatever documents he needed during the chaos of the funeral arrangements. The lenders would simply assume the grieving son was handling the estate. By denying the $20,000 medical loan, Nicholas had actively attempted to execute his own father. Harold surviving the surgery was not a relief to his son. It was a catastrophic problem. Harold's continued existence was a direct threat to the fraudulent $15 million corporate acquisition. A deep and silent rage ignited inside Harold's chest. It burned infinitely hotter than the surgical wounds. For years, he had endured his son's toxic elitism and arrogant dismissals. He had stayed quiet to keep the peace. He had locked his immense fortune in a blind trust to protect his legacy from being squandered. He had allowed Nicholas to believe he was nothing more than an impoverished old man living on a fixed pension. But his passive endurance had only emboldened his son to commit the ultimate betrayal. Harold stared at the sterile white ceiling of the intensive care unit. He did not feel the urge to cry. He did not feel the urge to call the local police and report a simple burglary. Calling the police would merely result in a minor trespassing charge. It would not balance the scales. Nicholas had tried to sentence him to death over a corporate real estate deal. The response needed to be absolute. It needed to be a calculated financial execution that would completely strip Nicholas of everything he valued. The legacy property deeds that Diana had just stolen were entirely worthless. 10 years ago, Harold had legally transferred absolute ownership of the house and all surrounding land into his impenetrable blind trust. The papers Nicholas currently held were nothing more than obsolete pieces of historical parchment. When Nicholas presented those forged documents to his corporate investors, he would be committing federal wire fraud. Harold took a slow and agonizing breath, letting the sterile hospital air fill his lungs. He needed to coordinate with his wealth manager immediately. He needed to prepare the legal trap before Nicholas could realize the documents were void. The era of the quiet and disregarded father was officially over. Harold closed his eyes and began to meticulously engineer the total destruction of his son's life. The harsh fluorescent light of the intensive care unit reflected off the cracked screen of the prepaid burner phone in Harold's trembling hand. Every shallow breath he took sent a jagged wave of fire across his freshly sutured abdomen, but the physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the glacial, terrifying clarity washing over his mind. He lay trapped in the narrow hospital bed, the heavy narcotic painkillers fighting a losing battle against the pure adrenaline flooding his bloodstream. He did not blink. He could not look away. On the small digital display, the live security feed from his living room played out in absolute, undeniable high definition. Nicholas tossed the bent steel pry bar onto the hardwood floor. The heavy metallic clatter was silent on the video feed, but Harold felt the impact reverberate through his very bones. The locked filing cabinet, a cheap metal relic Harold had kept for decades, stood ruined, its locking mechanism shattered and its drawers hanging open like broken jaws. Diana fell to her knees amidst the chaotic sea of shredded manila folders and discarded utility bills. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed through the scattered documents with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She was not acting like the polished, elitist wife of a highly successful commercial property developer. She was acting like a scavenger tearing meat from a carcass. Harold watched his daughter-in-law violently toss aside his old tax returns and expired insurance policies. She was hunting. They were both hunting. Then Diana froze. Her shoulders hitched and she reached deep into the bottom drawer, pulling out a thick, faded red folder. Even through the small screen of the burner phone, Harold instantly recognized it. It was the legacy property file. It contained the original 40-year-old physical deeds to his modest suburban house and the 3 acres of undeveloped adjacent land he had purchased when Nicholas was barely old enough to walk. Harold had cleared the brush on that land with his own bleeding hands. He had paid off the mortgage by working grueling double shifts, sacrificing every ounce of his own comfort to ensure his family always had a fortress of absolute security. Now his only son was actively stealing the very foundation of that security, while he believed his father was dying on a surgical table. Diana opened the red folder, her eyes frantically scanning the heavy parchment deeds. A wide, euphoric smile broke across her face. She held the papers up toward Nicholas. The video feed captured Nicholas letting out a massive breath of relief. He threw his head back and laughed. It was not a chuckle of minor success. It was a deep, victorious laugh, his shoulders shaking with the profound release of a man who had just narrowly escaped a fatal disaster. He grabbed Diana by the arms, pulling her up from the floor, and kissed her deeply, clutching the stolen property deeds against his chest. Harold lowered the phone. The screen went dark, plunging the hospital bed back into the clinical gloom of the intensive care unit. A normal man would have pressed the call button. A normal man would have demanded the nurses dial the police to report a home invasion. But Harold possessed a fiercely analytical mind, a mind that had spent 4 decades calculating structural weak points and catastrophic load failures. Calling the local authorities would merely result in a minor trespassing charge. Nicholas would undoubtedly spin a lie, claiming he was simply securing his sick father's affairs in a moment of panic. The police would view it as a tragic family misunderstanding, but Harold knew the absolute truth. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated predatory extraction. A man who truly possessed $15 million in liquid corporate escrow does not break into a middle-class home with a pry bar. Nicholas was drowning in a financial abyss of his own making, and he was using his father's impending death as a lifeline. A cold, unyielding silence settled over Harold. The heartbroken, disregarded father who had begged for $20,000 just hours ago was dead excised on the operating table along with the cancerous tumor. In his place, a silent, meticulous adversary was born. Harold reached across the sterile hospital tray, ignoring the searing pain ripping through his side, and dialed a memorized 12-digit number on the burner phone. The line rang exactly once before it was answered. Gordon Harold whispered into the receiver, his voice a dry, rasping hiss against the plastic. Harold, the deep, gravelly voice of Gordon Blake, replied instantly. Gordon was not just a wealth manager. He was a ruthless, highly aggressive financial attorney who operated entirely in the shadows, navigating the complex labyrinths of offshore accounts and ironclad trusts with predatory precision. I received the alert that your medical deposit cleared. Are you stable? I am alive, Harold said, his eyes fixed on the blank wall opposite his bed. But the perimeter is breached. Nicholas is inside my house. He just breached the primary filing cabinet. He took the legacy property deeds. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Does he know about the trust? No, Harold replied, the cold resolve hardening his tone. He thinks I am a broke, dying old man. He thinks those papers are active collateral. He told me yesterday he was closing a $15 million commercial acquisition, but his liquidity was tied up. He lied. He is desperate, Gordon. He needs me dead to secure something massive. I need you here right now. Bring the encrypted terminal. We are going to tear his corporate empire down to the studs. I am on my way, Gordon said, the line immediately going dead. Harold dropped the phone onto the blanket. He focused entirely on his breathing, forcing his heart rate to slow, conserving every ounce of his remaining physical strength for the war that was about to commence. He waited in the sterile silence, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the distant, muffled footsteps of the hospital staff echoing down the hallway. 40 minutes later, the heavy door to the intensive care unit silently pushed open. A man wearing the crisp, immaculate white coat of a senior hospital administrator stepped into the dim room. A laminated security badge swung from his lapel, bearing a fake name and a barcode that bypassed the strict visitation protocols. Gordon Blake closed the door behind him, turning the heavy deadbolt until it clicked solidly into place. He pulled off the white coat, revealing a tailored dark charcoal suit underneath the uniform of an executioner. Gordon did not offer any sympathetic greetings. He moved with swift, mechanical efficiency. He pulled a sleek, reinforced black laptop from a leather satchel and set it down directly on the rolling metal tray hovering over Harold's bed. He connected a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot to the side of the machine, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across Harold's exhausted face. How much pain are you in? Gordon asked, not looking away from the cascading lines of digital code scrolling across the monitor. Enough to keep me awake, Harold whispered, shifting his weight slightly to look at the screen. Run the shadow audit. I want to see exactly how deep the rot goes. Gordon initiated a secure breach into the federal corporate registry networks, masking their digital footprint through a series of offshore proxy servers. We are bypassing the standard credit bureaus, Gordon explained, his voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet room. If Nicholas is moving $15 million, there will be a massive paper trail in the commercial escrow registries. We are going to find exactly where his capital is parked, who his lenders are, and what he is using as leverage. Harold watched as the screen fragmented into multiple cascading windows. Complex financial ledgers, corporate shell company filings, and banking wire transfers began to populate the display. Gordon typed furiously, isolating the tax identification numbers associated with Nicholas's primary development firm. The progress bar crept across the screen, pulling heavily guarded financial data from the deepest vaults of the commercial real estate sector. They sat in absolute silence as the laptop processed the massive data request. Harold felt the sting of the surgical wounds pulse in time with the blinking cursor on the screen. He was watching his son's entire fabricated reality being stripped bare, digitized, and exposed in the cold light of the hospital room. He was preparing to look directly into the heart of the betrayal, fully aware that whatever numbers appeared on that screen would irrevocably alter the trajectory of their remaining time on Earth. The audit was running, and there was absolutely no turning back. Gordon sat motionless before the glowing screen of the secure laptop. The stark blue light illuminated the deep lines of grim realization etched across his face. He turned the heavy monitor slightly so Harold could view the final aggregated report. The digital ledger was a massacre. Nicholas did not possess a corporate empire. He possessed a fragile house of cards, constructed entirely out of crushing debt and desperate lies. The shadow audit laid everything bare in undeniable columns of red text. For the past 3 years, Nicholas had been hemorrhaging capital at an astonishing rate. His luxury vehicles, his tailored suits, his extravagant dinners, they were all financed by predatory mezzanine loans with suffocating interest rates. The $15 million commercial real estate acquisition he had so arrogantly boasted about on the phone was not a triumph of business acumen. It was a frantic final gamble. He was attempting to buy a massive downtown complex simply to generate immediate rental revenue to satisfy his aggressive creditors before they dragged him into federal bankruptcy court and liquidated his entire life. But a commercial bank does not lend $15 million to a man with empty pockets and failing shell companies. They require a tangible asset. They require ironclad collateral. Gordon navigated through a maze of encrypted proxy servers and clicked on a file embedded deep within the escrow registry. A scanned legal document materialized on the laptop screen. It was a guarantor pledge agreement. Harold stared at the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. He felt the cold, sterile air of the intensive care unit freeze the blood in his veins. The document listed his exact home address. It detailed the precise acreage of the undeveloped land he had cleared with his own hands decades ago. It appraised his entire life work at exactly $3.2 million. And at the very bottom of the final page, sitting right above a fraudulent notary seal, was his own signature. Harold leaned closer to the glowing screen, completely ignoring the burning pain ripping through his fresh surgical incisions. He studied the loops and the sharp angles of the dark ink. It was an incredibly good imitation. The slight slant of the capital letters and the heavy pressure on the ending strokes were almost perfect. But Harold was a civil engineer. He had spent his entire professional life drafting blueprints and signing off on structural tolerances where a single millimeter of error meant total catastrophic failure. He knew his own hand intimately. He told Gordon the signature was an absolute forgery. Gordon did not look surprised. He simply nodded slowly and opened a secondary subfolder attached to the commercial loan agreement. Gordon explained that the corporate lenders were ruthless, but they were certainly not foolish. They saw the massive risk in Nicholas and his failing property portfolio. They had placed the $15 million into a heavily guarded escrow account. They had approved the acquisition on paper, but they absolutely refused to release the actual funds until one final unyielding condition was met. Harold read the strict terms of the escrow release scrolling slowly down the bright monitor. The financial jargon was thick and intentionally convoluted, but the core mandate was brutally simple. To prevent collateral fraud, the lending institution required the primary guarantor to appear in person at their corporate offices to legally verify the pledged assets. The deadline for this in-person verification was Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Gordon pointed to a small legal addendum buried at the very bottom of the contract. It was a standard mortality clause inserted by the cautious underwriters. If the primary guarantor was incapacitated or deceased prior to the finalization of the escrow, the lenders required a certified death certificate. Upon receipt of the death certificate, the property would legally bypass the strict verification process and transfer immediately to the next of kin. That next of kin was Nicholas. The multi-million-dollar funds would then automatically release from escrow. The horrific truth struck Harold with the devastating force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. He fell back against the stiff hospital pillows, staring blindly at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. Nicholas had known exactly what he was doing when he rejected the desperate plea for the $20,000 medical loan. He had not refused the money because his liquidity was tied up. He had not told his father that the experimental surgery was a terrible return on investment out of simple spite or casual corporate arrogance. He had coldly calculated the odds of his father's survival. Harold realized with absolute certainty that his son had needed him to die. If Harold had succumbed to the aggressive tumor wrapping dangerously around his renal artery, he would never have discovered the forged collateral documents. The timeline was perfectly and evilly engineered. Nicholas would have played the role of the devastated grieving son over the long weekend. On Monday morning, he would have walked into the lender's sprawling boardroom dressed in a sharp black suit, carrying a freshly printed death certificate. He would have handed over his father's entire life to satisfy his corporate debt. He would have buried his father in the dirt and walked away with $15 million. The refusal of the $20,000 was not a simple rejection. It was an active, premeditated execution. By explicitly denying the funds for the life-saving robotic excision, Nicholas had literally attempted to murder his own father by weaponizing the cancer against him. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the sterile hospital room. The rhythmic, synthetic beeping of the electrocardiogram monitor seemed to grow louder, drowning out the low hum of the laptop fan. Harold felt a profound and absolute shift occur deep within his soul. The quiet, passive man who had patiently endured his son's toxic elitism for years was gone. The father who had silently accepted being treated as a useless burden was completely eradicated from existence. The blind trust he had established 10 years ago to protect his wealth was the only reason his house was not already gone. Nicholas did not know about the trust. Nicholas firmly believed the forged deeds he had just stolen were legally binding. Nicholas believed he had successfully trapped his dying father in an inescapable financial corner. But Nicholas had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He had severely underestimated the sheer analytical resilience of the man who raised him. Harold turned his head slowly to look at Gordon. The wealth manager was watching him with a quiet, predatory intensity. Gordon asked what Harold wanted to do next. Harold did not hesitate. His voice was no longer the weak, raspy whisper of a dying man recovering from major trauma. It was cold, flat, and entirely devoid of mercy. He told Gordon they were going to let Nicholas walk directly into his own trap. They were going to let him believe the forgery was completely secure. They were going to let him step into that glass-walled boardroom on Monday morning, thinking he had won the ultimate prize. The realization of his son's murderous intent had burned away every last ounce of parental hesitation. Harold was no longer trying to protect his son from the harsh consequences of his actions. He was going to orchestrate those consequences with maximum destructive force. He was going to unleash a financial and legal reckoning so devastating that Nicholas would never be able to recover. The tumor had been physically removed from his body, but the true disease was still out there, walking freely through his home and stealing his legacy. The time for silent endurance was over. The time for absolute eradication had begun. Harold stared at the pale blue light of the encrypted monitor. The sheer gravity of the situation settled over him like a suffocating physical weight pressing down on his chest. Nicholas had not simply made a poor financial calculation. His son had tied his entire corporate survival to a highly fraudulent loan, and he desperately needed a death certificate to finalize the transaction. Harold realized with a chilling and absolute clarity that his own beating heart was the only obstacle standing between his son and $15 million. If Harold survived the robotic surgical excision and woke up to review his personal property records, Nicholas would be immediately exposed. His continued survival was a direct existential threat to his son's freedom. This meant Nicholas had explicitly sent him to the operating table, hoping the aggressive cancer would act as the ultimate silent assassin. Gordon Blake did not offer any useless words of comfort or hollow sympathies. The wealth manager operated purely on ruthless logic and tactical legal warfare. Gordon closed the security video feed and opened a new encrypted digital window on his reinforced laptop. He told Harold that they were going to dismantle Nicholas completely, piece by piece. Gordon explained the exact nature of the trap they were about to spring. He reminded Harold of the complex legal restructuring they had executed exactly 10 years ago. Back then, Harold had recognized the reckless ambition and toxic entitlement burning in his young son. Nicholas had always viewed money as a weapon of status rather than a tool for security. Harold had watched his son treat honest working people with profound disdain, and he had known then that his massive fortune would only fuel a destructive fire. Therefore, he had taken absolute preemptive measures to protect his hard-earned legacy from being squandered. Harold had legally transferred every single financial asset, including the house and the surrounding undeveloped acreage, into an ironclad blind trust. The faded red folder that Nicholas and Diana had just stolen from the shattered filing cabinet contained the original physical deeds to the property. But those specific pieces of parchment had been rendered legally obsolete a full decade ago. They were nothing more than worthless historical artifacts. Gordon typed a rapid sequence of commands to access the primary trust records, verifying that their digital barricades remained entirely undisturbed. Nicholas was currently holding completely void documents, but the true destructive beauty of their counteroffensive lay in the fact that Nicholas had absolutely no idea the blind trust even existed. He firmly believed he had successfully secured the authentic collateral required to save his bankrupt firm from total liquidation. Harold felt the heavy narcotic fog continue to recede from his mind, replaced entirely by a sharp and unyielding focus. He asked Gordon what would happen when Nicholas presented the forged deeds to the commercial lenders on Monday morning. Gordon let out a low and entirely humorless laugh. He explained that the corporate lenders were backed by a massive federal banking syndicate. The exact moment Nicholas submitted a forged signature to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial loan, he would not just be committing a simple white-collar crime. He would immediately trigger severe federal wire fraud statutes. Because the fraudulent transaction involved crossing state lines and deliberately defrauding a federally insured financial institution, the legal penalties would be absolutely devastating. The tactical strategy was crystal clear. If they stopped Nicholas right now by calling the local police, the crime would be strictly limited to breaking and entering and attempted property theft. Nicholas would undoubtedly hire a team of expensive defense attorneys and meticulously spin a narrative of a simple family misunderstanding. He would claim he was merely trying to secure his sick father's estate in a moment of extreme emotional panic. He might entirely avoid a lengthy prison sentence and walk away with a minor probationary slap on the wrist. But if they remained perfectly silent and allowed Nicholas to walk into that opulent corporate boardroom on Monday morning, the trap would snap shut with irreversible and catastrophic force. Harold agreed without a single shred of hesitation. The physical cancer had been successfully cut from his body, but the true poison still infected his family. It needed to be violently and permanently excised. Gordon began to draft a series of highly classified legal injunctions on the laptop. He told Harold that he would formally notify the federal banking authorities exactly 5 minutes after Nicholas initiated the final escrow transfer. The federal agents would silently move in and secure the perimeter before Nicholas even had time to leave the corporate building. To finalize the snare, Gordon required Harold's formal biometric authorization to unseal the blind trust and prepare the necessary legal counter-filings. Harold slowly reached out his trembling left hand. The intravenous fluid line pulled painfully against his bruised skin, but he completely ignored the physical agony. He pressed his thumb firmly against the glowing biometric scanner attached to the side of Gordon's reinforced machine. The device emitted a soft electronic chime confirming his primary identity. The laptop screen flashed green, and a massive cascade of locked legal documents suddenly populated the digital display. Harold watched intently as Gordon rapidly configured the final legal tripwires. Every single asset Harold owned was instantly wrapped in an impenetrable protective legal freeze. If any unauthorized entity attempted to verify the stolen deeds, the automated banking system would immediately flag the transaction as a hostile federal breach. Harold felt a profound sense of dark finality settle deep within his tired bones. He had spent his entire adult life building an unbreakable fortress to protect his family from the harsh realities of the world. Now he was intentionally weaponizing that exact same fortress to completely destroy his only son. It was a terrible and overwhelmingly heavy burden, but it was absolutely necessary for the restoration of natural order. Gordon finalized the last line of complex security code and reached forward to close the encrypted terminal. He told Harold that the snare was perfectly set, and all they had to do was maintain absolute silence until Monday morning. Harold nodded slowly, letting his exhausted head sink back into the stiff hospital pillows. The intensive care unit was perfectly quiet, except for the steady, rhythmic pulsing of the heart monitor and the low hum of the medical equipment. They had successfully engineered the perfect silent reckoning. But before Gordon could disconnect the mobile hotspot, the heavy metal handle of the intensive care unit door suddenly clicked. The locking mechanism disengaged with a loud and incredibly sharp crack. The thick door swung open rapidly, completely, destroying the sterile silence of the room and forcing Harold to face an immediate threat he had not anticipated. Gordon Blake closed the laptop with a soft plastic click. He did not say goodbye or offer any hollow words of encouragement. He simply packed the encrypted machine into his dark leather satchel, turned his back, and slipped out the heavy door of the intensive care unit as silently as a shadow. Harold was left completely alone in the dim light of the hospital room. The rhythmic synthetic beeping of the electrocardiogram monitor was the only sound tethering him to the reality of the sterile environment. He had just set an irreversible federal trap for his own flesh and blood. The pure adrenaline that had fueled his precise coordination with the wealth manager was slowly beginning to fade. It was being rapidly replaced by the deep throbbing ache of his fresh surgical incisions and the heavy narcotic pull of the intravenous painkillers. But Harold could not afford to rest or surrender to the medication. He knew his son was coming. He knew the forged deeds would not be enough if Nicholas encountered any unexpected legal hurdles with the massive corporate lenders. Nicholas would need absolute operational control over his dying father. Less than 20 minutes after Gordon departed, the heavy metal handle of the intensive care door turned aggressively. The hinges groaned loudly as the door was shoved open with careless physical force. Nicholas marched into the room. He was still wearing the dark casual jacket and dark jeans from the security camera footage. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and his chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths. Diana trailed closely behind him, practically stepping on his heels to avoid being left in the hallway. She was trembling visibly, her eyes darting nervously around the quiet medical room. She gripped the leather straps of her canvas tote bag so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. Neither of them looked like grieving family members who were profoundly relieved to find their patriarch alive after a highly experimental robotic surgery. They looked like panicked and desperate criminals returning to the scene of a botched crime. Nicholas stopped aggressively at the foot of the hospital bed. He did not ask how Harold was feeling or if the physical pain was manageable. He did not ask what the chief surgeon had said about the aggressive cancer. Instead, he locked his dark eyes directly on the glowing green line of the heart monitor. He stared at the steady rising peaks of his father's heartbeat with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The pulsing monitor proved that Harold had successfully survived the high-risk procedure. That simple biological fact completely ruined $15 million worth of fraudulent corporate planning. "You should not have done this, Harold," Nicholas said, his voice a low, venomous hiss that echoed harshly against the acoustic ceiling tiles. "You are 72 years old, and you let them cut you open like a useless laboratory animal. Look at you. You are completely pathetic." Harold remained perfectly still against the stiff cotton sheets. He did not speak. He simply stared up at the man he had raised, listening to the horrific poison spilling freely from his son's mouth. This experimental surgery was a colossal mistake. Nicholas continued pacing angrily beside the narrow hospital bed. "Did you honestly think you were going to wake up and go back to a normal suburban life? You are going to be a complete physical invalid. You will require round-the-clock medical supervision and highly specialized care. You will need a massive team of home nurses and an endless supply of expensive pharmaceuticals just to keep breathing. You are going to bleed your entire retirement savings dry in a matter of months, just to sit in a cheap chair and stare at a blank wall. You have made yourself a massive financial burden to this entire family." Diana stood frozen near the closed door. She looked terrified by the sheer explicit cruelty of her husband's words, but she made absolutely no effort to stop his verbal assault. She was entirely complicit in the execution of their desperate financial scheme. Nicholas reached inside his dark jacket and pulled out a thick stack of crisp white legal documents. He tossed them violently onto the rolling metal tray hovering over Harold's chest. The heavy papers landed with a loud, dismissive slap. Harold slowly shifted his tired gaze from his son's furious face to the top page of the legal document. The bold black letters across the header were unmistakable even in the dim light. It was a comprehensive medical proxy and general power of attorney. If Harold signed those papers, he would immediately surrender absolute legal control over his physical body and his entire financial portfolio. Nicholas would gain the immediate authority to liquidate assets' empty bank accounts and authorize life-ending medical decisions without needing a single shred of additional legal oversight. It was the ultimate weapon of total disenfranchisement. "You are going to sign this right now," Nicholas demanded, pulling a black pen from his jacket pocket and shoving it onto the metal tray next to the documents. "You are going to give me full control of your estate so I can manage the absolute disaster you have created by surviving this procedure. I have major corporate investments that require my immediate attention, and I refuse to spend the next 5 years of my life wiping your chin and paying your endless medical debts." Harold looked calmly at the black pen. He felt the heavy narcotic fog trying to pull his consciousness under, but his analytical mind remained brilliantly sharp. He looked back up at Nicholas, maintaining a cold and absolute silence. He wanted his son to fill the empty space. He wanted Nicholas to voluntarily reveal the absolute depths of his depravity. When Harold did not reach for the pen, the thick vein in Nicholas' neck began to throb visibly. His face contorted into a terrifying mask of supreme arrogant rage. "Do you think this is a polite request?" Nicholas spat, leaning over the bed until his face was mere inches from Harold's bruised skin. "Do you think you have a choice in this matter? You are currently heavily sedated on federal narcotics. You just survived a massive physical trauma. I have a private psychiatric specialist on my payroll who is standing by in the lobby right now. If you refuse to sign these papers, I will make one phone call, and he will walk into this room and officially declare you mentally incompetent due to severe post-operative delirium." Diana let out a small whimpering sound from the corner of the room. But Nicholas ignored her completely, keeping his furious gaze locked on his silent father. "I will strip you of your legal rights before the sun goes down," Nicholas threatened, his voice dropping into a chillingly calm and ruthless register. "I will legally seize control of your house and your bank accounts whether you agree to it or not. And then I will immediately transfer you to the cheapest state-run nursing facility I can find. I will lock you in a dark room with a broken television and leave you there to rot. You will never see your house again. You will never see your garden again. You will die alone in a filthy, unfamiliar bed. So pick up the pen and sign the papers." The sheer magnitude of the threat hung heavily in the sterile air of the intensive care unit. Harold lay trapped beneath the thin medical sheets, listening to the rapid beeping of his own heart monitor. His son was not simply asking for financial control. His son was explicitly threatening to completely erase his humanity. Nicholas was entirely willing to condemn his father to a slow, agonizing death in a state-sponsored nightmare, simply to secure the collateral for a fraudulent commercial real estate acquisition. Every single sacrifice Harold had made over the past 40 years suddenly felt entirely meaningless. He had worked grueling double shifts at the engineering firm until his hands bled. He had skipped daily meals to ensure Nicholas could attend elite private preparatory schools. He had paid for expensive university tuitions and covered the massive down payments on luxury metropolitan apartments. He had given his son the entire world on a silver platter. And in return, his son was standing over his hospital bed, explicitly detailing how he planned to discard him like a piece of rotting garbage. Harold felt a profound and terrifying coldness settle deep into his bones. The quiet, gentle father who had always hoped for eventual family reconciliation was completely dead. The man occupying the hospital bed was now a clinical architect of destruction. He looked at the black pen resting on the metal tray. He looked at the thick stack of legal documents that would sign away his entire existence. Nicholas hovered over him, radiating a toxic, nervous energy. He was waiting for his father to break. He was waiting for the old man to surrender to the fear and sign away his life. But Nicholas did not know about the impenetrable blind trust. Nicholas did not know that the federal banking authorities were already being notified of his massive wire fraud. Nicholas did not know that every single word of his horrific threat was entirely useless because Harold had already engineered his absolute downfall. Harold slowly raised his left hand. The intravenous lines pulled tightly against his bruised skin, causing a sharp spike of pain to radiate up his arm. He ignored the physical agony completely. He extended his trembling fingers toward the metal tray and picked up the black pen. He wrapped his fingers around the smooth plastic, feeling the heavy weight of his son's expectations pressing down upon him. He looked directly into his son's eyes. He saw the desperate greed, the arrogant entitlement, and the absolute lack of human empathy. Harold held the pen suspended over the signature line of the general power of attorney, perfectly prepared to execute the next phase of the silent reckoning. Nicholas lunged forward and grabbed Harold's bruised hand. His grip was brutal and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. He shoved the cold plastic pen deep into his father's palm, folding Harold's trembling fingers around the heavy barrel. The sudden physical force sent a massive spike of agony straight through the fresh surgical incisions in Harold's abdomen, but the old man did not make a single sound. He kept his breathing shallow and his eyes locked on his son's furious face. Nicholas leaned in so close that Harold could smell the stale champagne and nervous sweat radiating from his collar. "Sign the damn papers!" Nicholas demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, guttural whisper. "You are completely out of options, old man. Do not make me walk into that hallway and bring the doctor inside. You will be chemically restrained before the sun sets, and you will never see the outside of a locked psychiatric ward for the rest of your miserable life." Diana stepped out from the shadows near the doorway. Her initial panic from the botched home invasion had entirely evaporated now that she saw how physically weak and helpless her father-in-law looked in the sterile hospital bed. She walked slowly toward the rolling metal tray, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She looked down at Harold with an expression of profound disgust. Her face was twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You really need to stop fighting us, Harold," Diana said, crossing her arms over her chest. "It is honestly getting pathetic. You think you can hold out and wait for Valerie to come save you? You think your precious little daughter is going to walk in here and hire a team of lawyers to fight this medical proxy? Valerie is completely ruined. She pawned the title to her only delivery van yesterday just to pay your hospital deposit. She drained her child's savings account down to absolute zero. She does not have a single dollar left to her name. If she even attempts to challenge us in probate court, we will crush her into total bankruptcy. We will take her floral shop and we will leave her and your grandson living on the street." Harold's heart hammered violently against his ribs. The electrocardiogram monitor began to beep at a frantic, accelerated pace, mirroring the intense surge of pure adrenaline flooding his system. Diana's words were designed to break his spirit, but they only poured highly combustible fuel onto the raging fire inside his chest. He pictured Valerie standing in the rain, completely sacrificing her entire future to save his life, while his son and daughter-in-law stood over his hospital bed, plotting to completely destroy them both. The absolute perversity of the situation required a superhuman level of discipline to endure. Harold looked at the black pen resting heavily in his hand. He looked at the thick stack of legal documents demanding his signature. His brilliant analytical mind rapidly calculated the tactical vectors of the battlefield. If he threw the pen across the room and told Nicholas to go to hell, the immediate consequences would be disastrous. Nicholas would immediately summon the corrupt psychiatrist from the hospital lobby. Harold was highly sedated on powerful federal narcotics, and he had just endured massive physical trauma. The corrupt doctor would easily draft a compelling medical evaluation, declaring Harold entirely incompetent due to severe post-operative delirium. Harold would be immediately stripped of his civil rights and locked inside a secured psychiatric wing. While the blind trust would absolutely protect his financial assets, a formal medical lockdown would severely delay Harold's ability to maneuver. Even worse, a public dispute in the hospital might spook Nicholas. If Nicholas felt threatened, he might hesitate. He might delay the massive commercial real estate transaction. He might take the forged property deeds to a private appraiser and discover they were legally void before he ever reached the bank. Harold realized with crystalline clarity that he could not afford to let Nicholas hesitate. He needed his son to be completely blinded by his own toxic arrogance. He needed Nicholas to walk out of this hospital room feeling like an invincible conqueror. For the federal wire fraud trap to snap shut with maximum destructive force, Nicholas had to willingly carry the forged property deeds and the signed medical proxy directly into the corporate boardroom on Monday morning. He had to present those fraudulent documents to the federal lenders in person. Harold needed to intentionally arm his son with the exact weapons that would guarantee his absolute incarceration. To execute the maneuver, Harold knew he had to completely surrender his pride. He had to play the role of the broken, defeated old man. Harold let his hand begin to shake violently. He forced his breathing to become ragged and erratic, perfectly mimicking the physical symptoms of a man succumbing to pure terror. He looked up at Nicholas, widening his eyes to project deep, overwhelming fear. He let a small, pathetic whimper escape his throat. "Please," Harold whispered, his voice intentionally weak and fractured. "Please, Nicholas, do not put me in a state facility. If I sign the proxy, will you let me go home? Will you let me stay in my own house?" Nicholas let out a loud, arrogant laugh. The sound was incredibly ugly, echoing with supreme, narcissistic triumph. He looked at Diana and smiled a vicious, victorious smile. He genuinely believed he had finally broken his father. He believed he had completely crushed the old man's spirit. Of course, Dad Nicholas lied, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "If you sign the papers right now and give me full control, I will personally make sure you get a nice, quiet nurse at home. You will be perfectly comfortable. But if you make me wait another minute, I will call the doctor into this room, and your life as a free man is entirely over." Harold did not hesitate any longer. He pressed the tip of the black pen against the thick legal paper. He intentionally altered his grip, dragging the pen across the signature line with a weak, wavering motion. He produced a fragile, trailing signature that perfectly resembled the desperate scrawl of a dying man. He signed the medical proxy, and he signed the general power of attorney, turning over absolute legal control of his life to a man who wanted him dead. Nicholas eagerly snatched the documents off the metal tray the exact second the pen lifted from the page. He rapidly flipped through the pages visually, verifying that every single signature line was completely filled. A massive wave of relief washed over his sweaty face. He folded the papers and shoved them deep inside his dark jacket, right next to the stolen property deeds. "You made the right choice, old man," Nicholas said, stepping away from the hospital bed. He did not offer a single word of gratitude. He did not touch his father. He simply looked at Harold with total dismissive contempt. "Do not try to call Valerie. Do not try to cause any problems with the hospital staff. I control your medical care now. I control your finances. I own you completely." Diana picked up her canvas bag and moved toward the hallway. "We have everything we need for the escrow release on Monday," she told Nicholas, her voice trembling with excited anticipation. "The bankers are going to clear the $15 million the second they see the collateral proxy." Nicholas nodded, turning his back on his father and walking out the door. The heavy metal handle clicked shut, leaving Harold entirely alone in the dim intensive care unit. Harold dropped the pen onto the floor. He let his shaking hand fall still. The pathetic, terrified expression completely vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of cold, absolute predatory focus. Nicholas had taken the bait. His son had eagerly armed himself with a suite of entirely fraudulent documents and was currently marching straight toward a federal banking syndicate. Harold closed his eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of his heart monitor. The trap was now fully armed and locked. Monday morning would bring an absolute bloodbath. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiations. Harold was going to completely eradicate his son from the corporate world, and he was going to burn his empire to the ground. The silent reckoning was no longer a plan. It was an inevitable, devastating reality. "Wait for Monday," Harold thought to himself, breathing through the surgical fire in his side. Just wait for Monday. All the dominoes were perfectly aligned, and Nicholas had just pushed the very first one over. The destruction was going to be magnificent. Harold held the pen suspended over the signature line of the general power of attorney. The smooth plastic casing felt heavy and foreign in his fingers. He stared at the blank space where his name was supposed to surrender his entire existence into the hands of a predator. His analytical mind raced through the tactical permutations of the immediate battlefield. If he signed the document right now in the dim light of the intensive care unit, he would grant Nicholas absolute and immediate control over his life. Nicholas could walk out of the hospital tonight and legally authorize the corrupt psychiatrist to lock Harold inside a secured ward by Saturday morning. Even worse, signing the papers tonight would detach Harold from the final confrontation. To ensure the federal wire fraud trap snapped shut with maximum destructive force, Harold needed to link the signing of the proxy directly to the presentation of the forged legacy deeds. He needed Nicholas to bring all the fraudulent documents into the corporate boardroom at the exact same moment. Harold realized he could not simply refuse to sign. Outright defiance would trigger the immediate psychological lockdown Nicholas had just threatened. He needed a valid, undeniable reason to delay the execution of the documents until Monday morning. He needed an excuse that a ruthless and paranoid man like Nicholas would completely accept without suspicion. Harold knew there was only one language his son truly understood. It was the language of absolute physical domination and pure narcissistic ego. Harold had to give his son exactly what he wanted to see. He had to become a genuinely broken and helpless victim right in front of his eyes. Slowly and with deliberate precision, Harold slid his left hand across the stiff hospital sheets. He moved his fingers toward the thick plastic tubing that connected the heavy narcotic painkiller to his intravenous port. Nicholas was pacing furiously at the foot of the bed, completely focused on the unsigned documents resting on the metal tray. Diana was staring nervously at the closed door. Neither of them noticed Harold's subtle movement. Harold found the small plastic locking valve that controlled the flow of the powerful chemical analgesic. He wrapped his thumb and forefinger around the mechanism. He took a short, shallow breath to brace himself, and then he twisted the valve, completely shutting off the life-saving medication. The transition was not gradual. It was an immediate and catastrophic explosion of pure agony. The moment the narcotic flow ceased, the protective chemical barrier in his bloodstream dissolved. A massive wave of searing fire tore across his freshly sutured abdomen. It felt as though a serrated hunting knife was being dragged slowly through his organs. Harold's body reacted with a violent, authentic physiological shock. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead. His breathing instantly became ragged and shallow. The muscles in his arms and chest seized and began to tremble uncontrollably. He did not have to fake the physical collapse. The sheer intensity of the post-operative trauma overwhelmed his nervous system. The black pen slipped from Harold's violently shaking fingers. It dropped from his hand and clattered loudly against the sterile surface of the metal rolling tray. The sudden noise shattered the tense silence of the hospital room. Nicholas stopped pacing and whipped around his face, twisting into a mask of pure, aggressive fury. "Pick up the pen!" Nicholas shouted, stepping aggressively toward the side of the bed. "Stop playing games with me, old man. You are going to sign those papers right now, or I swear to God I will walk into that hallway and bring the doctor inside." Harold forced his eyes to roll back slightly, letting his eyelids flutter. He looked up at his son through a hazy, unfocused stare. He allowed his head to loll weakly against the pillow. The trembling in his hands was so severe that the metal tray rattled against the side rails of the hospital bed. "I cannot see," Harold whispered, his voice a dry, authentic rasp of pure physical suffering. "The medication. It is too heavy. The room is spinning, Nicholas. I cannot focus on the lines. The letters are completely blurred. I cannot hold the pen." Nicholas leaned over the bed, staring intensely into his father's face. He was looking for a lie. He was a predator searching for a trap. But what he saw was an old man in genuine, uncontrollable agony. He saw the cold sweat pooling on his father's collarbone. He heard the erratic, frantic beeping of the electrocardiogram monitor, reflecting a heart struggling against massive trauma. The physical breakdown was an absolute reality. Nicholas sneered, his upper lip curling in profound disgust at the sight of his father's weakness. "You are completely useless," Nicholas spat, crossing his arms over his expensive jacket. "You cannot even manage to write your own name. Do you expect me to sit in this miserable hospital room all night waiting for you to regain your basic motor functions? I have a $15 million acquisition to finalize. I do not have time for this pathetic display." Diana stepped away from the door and moved closer to the bed, her previous panic entirely replaced by a cold, mocking confidence. "You really should just give up, Harold," she said, her tone dripping with venom. "If you think Valerie is going to help you avoid this, you are completely delusional. Your precious daughter is totally bankrupt. She does not have a single dime to hire a lawyer to fight us in court. She cannot save you. No one is coming to save you." Harold knew this was the critical moment. The window of opportunity to set the final hook was closing rapidly. He fought through the suffocating curtain of pain and forced himself to look directly into his son's arrogant eyes. He gathered every ounce of his remaining strength to deliver the psychological masterstroke. "You have won," Nicholas, Harold whispered, forcing his voice to sound utterly defeated and hollow. "I accept it. You hold all the cards. I will sign everything over to you. I will surrender the estate and the proxy. But please do not leave me to the state doctors. Let me do this with dignity." Nicholas narrowed his eyes, his suspicion warring heavily against his massive ego. When Nicholas demanded harshly, "When exactly are you going to sign them?" "Monday morning." Harold gasped, letting his trembling hand fall limply against his chest. "I will sign them on Monday." But not in this hospital. Arrange for a medical transport. Bring me to your office. I want to see your new building. I want to see the corporate empire you have built before I sign my entire life away to you. Let me see my son's ultimate success." The profound silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Harold watched his son's face carefully. He was injecting pure liquid narcissism directly into Nicholas's veins. For a man driven entirely by status and the desperate need to dominate his father, the proposal was an intoxicating narcotic. The visual image of his defeated, broken father being wheeled into his glittering corporate headquarters to formally surrender his independence was absolutely irresistible. It was a victory lap that Nicholas could not possibly deny himself. Nicholas rapidly calculated the logistical timeline. It was Friday evening. The commercial lenders were not going to release the massive escrow funds until Monday morning anyway. Having his father physically present in the boardroom to sign the medical proxy moments before handing over the forged collateral deeds felt perfectly aligned with his grand corporate illusion. Nicholas reached down and snatched the blank legal documents off the metal tray. He folded them sharply and shoved them deep inside his jacket next to the stolen legacy property deeds. A cold, triumphant smile stretched across his face. Monday morning at 9:00, Nicholas stated, his voice dripping with supreme, arrogant satisfaction. "I will send a private medical transport to collect you. You will be brought directly to my executive boardroom. You will look at the massive empire I have secured without any of your help, and then you will sign every single page. If you try to cause a scene or refuse to sign when you arrive, the transport team will take you straight from my office to the locked psychiatric ward. Do you understand me, old man?" "I understand," Harold whispered, closing his eyes in feigned submission. Nicholas turned his back on the hospital bed without another word. He grabbed Diana by the arm and practically dragged her out of the intensive care unit. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing the room in quiet isolation. Harold remained perfectly still for 10 seconds, ensuring the hallway was completely clear. Then the pathetic trembling instantly stopped. The mask of the broken, defeated victim evaporated. He reached down with a steady, bloodless hand and twisted the small plastic valve on the intravenous line. The locking mechanism clicked open. The heavy narcotic painkiller immediately flooded back into his bloodstream, pushing back the raging fire in his abdomen. Harold's breathing slowed, settling into a deep calm and rhythmic pattern. He stared at the closed door, his dark eyes turning as hard and cold as forged steel. His son had eagerly swallowed the bait. The trap was locked. Monday morning would not be a victory lap for Nicholas. It would be a slaughter. Monday morning arrived with a cold, driving rain that washed the city streets in a dull, gray light. Harold stepped out of the hired transport vehicle and stood on the wet pavement, staring up at the towering glass and steel structure. The corporate headquarters of his son's firm dominated the downtown skyline like a massive monument to unchecked arrogance. Harold gripped the handle of a thick wooden cane he had purchased specifically for this performance. He leaned heavily onto the carved wood, allowing his shoulders to slump and his knees to tremble slightly. Every single movement was a meticulously calculated physical deception. He forced his breathing to remain shallow and erratic, projecting the image of a broken man who had barely survived a catastrophic surgical trauma. He slowly crossed the sprawling marble lobby toward the private executive elevators. The security guards and passing executives barely paid any attention to the frail old man dragging his feet across the polished stone floor. They saw nothing but a dying ghost. They had absolutely no idea they were looking at the architect of their employer's total destruction. The high-speed elevator shot upward, pushing a heavy wave of pressure against Harold's eardrums. He closed his eyes and mentally reviewed every single tactical parameter of the trap he had constructed. The federal banking authorities had already been notified by Gordon. The blind trust was fully locked and completely impenetrable. The only remaining variable was Nicholas presenting the fraudulent documents to the financial syndicate. The elevator doors slid open with a soft electronic chime revealing a massive reception area bathed in harsh, sterile light. An immaculate assistant dressed in a sharp gray suit immediately stood up from behind a white circular desk. She looked at Harold with a mixture of professional courtesy and mild disgust. She quickly walked around the desk to guide him down the long corridor. Harold followed her, slowly dragging his left foot intentionally to emphasize his supposed physical deterioration. The corridor was lined with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the storm-soaked city below. Harold ignored the dramatic skyline. His entire focus was locked entirely on the large double-glass doors at the very end of the hallway. The executive boardroom was waiting. The assistant pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped aside to let Harold enter the sprawling space. The room was dominated by a massive polished mahogany table that stretched nearly 20 feet across the center of the floor. 5 men sat around the dark wood. Harold analyzed the battlefield instantly. Nicholas sat at the direct head of the table, radiating a toxic aura of supreme, absolute confidence. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and a silk tie, projecting the illusion of a highly successful corporate titan. Sitting immediately to his right was a man Harold recognized as a notorious and highly aggressive corporate defense attorney. The lawyer possessed cold, dead eyes and a permanent scowl of superiority. Sitting across from them were 3 older men dressed in conservative gray suits. These were the principal investors representing the massive federal financial syndicate. These were the men who controlled the $15 million Nicholas desperately needed to save his sinking empire. They were the men who required the authentic collateral deeds. They were the final targets of the federal wire fraud snare. Nicholas immediately stood up when Harold entered the room. He smiled a wide, benevolent smile perfectly designed for his wealthy audience. He walked quickly toward the door and placed a heavy hand on Harold's frail shoulder. He guided his father toward an empty leather chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. Nicholas played the role of the devoted and deeply concerned son with absolute, terrifying perfection. He pulled the heavy chair out and helped Harold sit down, making sure the investors witnessed his supposed family loyalty. Harold sank into the soft leather, letting his wooden cane clatter loudly against the floor. He let his head fall forward slightly, taking short, gasping breaths. He looked across the vast expanse of the table at the 3 federal investors. They looked back at him with expressions of mild impatience and extreme corporate detachment. They did not care about an old man's physical suffering. They only cared about securing their massive financial investment. They wanted the land deeds verified, and they wanted the transaction finalized so they could return to their lucrative daily routines. Nicholas returned to the head of the table and unbuttoned his expensive jacket. He addressed the 3 principal investors with a smooth, practiced cadence. He explained that his father had recently suffered a severe medical emergency and was currently recovering from major surgery. Nicholas smoothly detailed how he was stepping up to take full administrative control over his father's extensive personal estate. He spun a beautiful web of lies, claiming the commercial real estate acquisition was a joint family venture designed to secure their legacy for future generations. The investors nodded slowly, hanging on to every single fraudulent word. The aggressive corporate lawyer remained completely silent, simply watching the exchange with predatory focus. Harold sat quietly at the end of the table, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his son's deception. Nicholas was effortlessly committing massive federal fraud right in front of an entire room of professional witnesses. The absolute arrogance required to execute such a brazen lie was almost impossible to comprehend. Nicholas reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. He opened the flap and extracted the exact same forged legacy property deeds he had stolen from Harold's filing cabinet. He placed the fraudulent documents onto the center of the polished mahogany table for the 3 principal investors to clearly see. He then pulled out the medical proxy and the general power of attorney that Harold had supposedly signed in the intensive care unit. Nicholas arranged the papers in a neat, precise stack. He slid the entire pile of documents firmly across the smooth, dark wood until they came to a complete stop directly in front of Harold's trembling hands. Nicholas pulled a silver fountain pen from his inside pocket and placed it on top of the papers. The entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. All 5 men stared directly at Harold, waiting for the final act of total submission. Nicholas leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table. He looked his father directly in the eyes. His voice was soft and gentle, projecting absolute false comfort for the benefit of the watching syndicate members. He told his father to just sign right there. He promised Harold that signing the final collateral release forms meant he would completely take care of everything for him. Harold looked down at the silver fountain pen resting heavily on top of the fraudulent documents. The entire corporate boardroom was perfectly silent, waiting for the final stroke of ink that would seal his absolute ruin. Nicholas leaned forward over the polished mahogany table with a look of pure, greedy anticipation burning in his dark eyes. The 3 principal investors checked their expensive gold watches, clearly impatient to finalize the massive $15 million transfer and return to their lucrative daily routines. The aggressive corporate lawyer tapped his manicured fingers against the dark wood, projecting an aura of supreme legal invincibility. They all firmly believed they were watching the last pathetic moments of a broken, dying man surrendering his entire existence. They were entirely wrong. Harold did not reach for the silver pen. Instead, he casually flicked his left wrist. The heavy metal pen rolled across the smooth, polished wood and plummeted over the edge of the large table. It hit the floor with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed loudly against the thick glass walls of the room. Nicholas blinked, his arrogant, triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Before anyone could speak or demand an explanation, Harold opened his right hand and completely let go of the thick wooden cane he had been leaning on. The heavy wooden prop crashed violently against the floorboards. The sudden loud noise made the 3 older investors jump in their luxurious leather chairs. The pathetic, involuntary trembling in Harold's hands vanished instantly. His shallow, erratic breathing completely stopped. He rolled his broad shoulders back and sat up perfectly straight in the deep leather chair. The frail, sickly posture he had meticulously maintained since leaving the intensive care unit evaporated into thin air. He looked up at the men gathered around the long table, and his dark eyes were as cold and sharp as shattered glass. The sudden physical transformation was so absolute and so jarring that a heavy, suffocating tension instantly flooded the sprawling corporate space. Nicholas stared at his father in total, paralyzed shock. The arrogant certainty on his flushed face began to fracture rapidly, replaced by a creeping sense of profound confusion and sudden dread. He opened his mouth to shout a harsh demand, but the angry words died completely in his throat. Harold reached deliberately inside the breast pocket of his tailored dark coat. His movements were smooth, steady, and completely devoid of any pain or hesitation. He pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier. He did not even look at his son. He completely ignored Nicholas and locked his piercing gaze directly on the lead investor sitting across the table. Harold placed his large, steady hand flat on top of the dossier and slid it firmly across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. The heavy leather package glided smoothly across the polished surface, coming to a perfect sliding stop right in front of the lead investor's hands. "You cannot use my properties as collateral," Nicholas Harold said. His voice was no longer a weak, raspy whisper begging for mercy. It was a deep, resonant baritone that carried the absolute, undeniable authority of a patriarch who had built a massive empire from absolutely nothing. It was a terrifying voice that demanded total, absolute silence. Nicholas slammed his hands flat onto the table, his face twisting into a mask of pure, aggressive fury. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Old man Nicholas shouted, his voice echoing harshly in the confined glass room. "You sign those papers right now, or I swear I will have you dragged out of this building in a straitjacket." Harold did not blink or react to the furious threat. He kept his cold eyes locked on the lead investor, who was slowly opening the thick leather dossier with slightly trembling hands. Right at that exact pivotal moment, the heavy double glass doors at the back of the boardroom swung wide open. Gordon Blake stepped into the tense room. The wealth manager was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, carrying his signature dark leather satchel. His face was a mask of cold, professional detachment. Gordon did not greet anyone or wait for an invitation. He turned around, calmly grasped the thick metal handles of the double doors, and pushed them firmly shut. He reached down and engaged the heavy commercial deadbolt. The loud mechanical click of the lock echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom, sealing them all inside. Nicholas spun around, his eyes wide with furious disbelief at the sudden intrusion. "Who the hell are you?" Nicholas demanded, taking a highly threatening step toward the locked doors. "This is a private corporate meeting. I am going to have security throw you out on the street right now." Gordon ignored the aggressive threat completely. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the soft carpeted floor. He stopped directly beside Harold's chair and looked straight at the three principal investors sitting in frozen shock. "My name is Gordon Blake," he stated, his voice calm, flat, and entirely devoid of any emotion. "I am the primary wealth manager and senior legal executor for the personal estate of Harold Caldwell. I am here to inform you that the commercial transaction you are attempting to finalize today is entirely fraudulent and deeply illegal." The aggressive corporate lawyer instantly jumped to his feet, his face flushed with professional outrage and defensive panic. "That is a completely baseless accusation," the lawyer shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Gordon. "We hold the original physical deeds to the property. We have the collateral officially verified. We have the medical proxy. You are illegally interfering with a federally regulated financial transfer." Gordon let out a low, humorless laugh that froze the very air in the large room. He reached slowly into his leather satchel and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper stamped with a massive red federal seal. He dropped it casually onto the center of the mahogany table. "You hold absolutely nothing," Gordon corrected, his voice cutting through the lawyer's desperate outrage with devastating surgical precision. "The physical deeds you currently possess are completely worthless. 10 years ago, my client recognized the extreme financial liabilities posed by his reckless son. To protect his hard-earned legacy, Harold Caldwell initiated a massive structural reorganization of his entire portfolio. Every single asset he owns, including the primary residential estate and the surrounding undeveloped acreage, was legally transferred into an irrevocable blind trust." The lead investor looked up from the open leather dossier, his face entirely drained of all living color. He stared at Gordon in absolute horror, and then looked down at the supposedly authentic property deeds Nicholas had placed on the table just moments before. "An irrevocable blind trust means the assets cannot be pledged, sold, or leveraged under any circumstances whatsoever," Gordon continued, pacing slowly behind Harold's chair. "The trust is completely sealed by federal mandate. The property deeds your client presented to you today were legally voided a full decade ago. They are nothing more than historical scrap paper." Nicholas stumbled backward, his legs suddenly struggling to support his own body weight. He looked at his father with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant corporate titan was completely gone, replaced by a panicked, desperate child, realizing he had just walked directly into a catastrophic, inescapable trap. "But the most important detail is the signature," Gordon said, stopping at the head of the table and picking up the forged escrow release form. Nicholas knew he did not have the legal authority to secure this massive $15 million loan, so he fabricated it out of thin air. The signature on these preliminary collateral forms, the exact signature you accepted to initiate this escrow transfer, is a blatant absolute forgery. The three principal investors stared at the forged documents in complete horrified silence. They were heavily backed by a massive federal banking syndicate. They knew exactly what those terrifying words meant. They were not looking at a simple family dispute over a medical proxy. They were actively sitting in a locked room with a man who had just attempted to defraud a federally insured institution out of $15 million using completely fabricated collateral. "You did not just lie to your father," Gordon said, turning his head to look directly at Nicholas. "You lied to the federal government. You committed massive premeditated wire fraud across state lines. And the federal banking authorities were officially notified the exact second you presented those fraudulent documents to this syndicate." Harold sat perfectly still in his leather chair, watching the absolute destruction of his son's toxic empire unfold before his eyes. He had sacrificed everything to build a lasting legacy, and now he was watching the natural order be violently and permanently restored. The trap had snapped shut with devastating force, and there was absolutely no escape for the boy who wanted him dead. The silence in the boardroom shattered with the violent force of a physical explosion. The absolute reality of Gordon Blake's words struck the mahogany table like a sudden lightning bolt. Diana, who had been standing near the peripheral wet bar, completely lost all control of her motor functions. The heavy ceramic coffee mug she was holding slipped right through her trembling fingers. It struck the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending hot, dark liquid splashing across the immaculate rug. The sharp, violent crash of the breaking ceramic was the exact catalyst that unleashed total chaos inside the locked corporate room. The three principal investors erupted simultaneously. Their previous demeanor of calm corporate detachment completely evaporated in an instant. The lead investor, a man who controlled billions in federal syndicate funds, slammed his fists onto the mahogany table and pushed himself backward. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stared at the forged property deeds resting near Harold's motionless hands, and then turned his furious, piercing gaze directly onto Nicholas. The sheer magnitude of the deception was almost impossible to process. Nicholas had not simply attempted to secure a high-risk commercial loan to cover a few outstanding operational debts. He had actively orchestrated a massive $15 million federal wire fraud using utterly worthless paper as collateral. The investors realized in a terrifying, heart-stopping instant that their massive capital release was secured by absolutely nothing. The entire corporate empire Nicholas had boasted about was a completely hollow shell floating on a sea of predatory debt and blatant criminal lies. The aggressive corporate defense attorney, who had sat so confidently beside Nicholas just moments before, instantly recognized the catastrophic legal peril closing in around them. He scrambled backward, scraping his heavy leather chair loudly against the floorboards. The lawyer practically threw his hands into the air, loudly declaring that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of the blind trust or the forged collateral signatures. He was desperately attempting to sever all legal ties to Nicholas before the federal hammer dropped. He knew that participating in a $15 million federal banking fraud would result in his immediate disbarment and a guaranteed prison sentence in a federal penitentiary. He abandoned his client without a single shred of hesitation, backing away until his shoulders pressed flat against the cold glass wall of the boardroom. The lead investor did not waste a single second screaming or making empty threats. He operated with the exact same ruthless efficiency that had built his financial syndicate over the decades. He reached into his tailored gray suit and pulled out his mobile phone. His hands were shaking with pure adrenaline, but his voice was terrifyingly calm and deliberate. He completely ignored Nicholas, who was gasping for air at the head of the table. The lead investor dialed a direct emergency line to the Federal Fraud Division. He spoke clearly into the receiver, stating his exact location, the precise nature of the $15 million fraudulent escrow transfer, and the explicit presence of highly forged collateral documents. He demanded immediate federal intervention to secure the premises. Nicholas heard the phone call and completely deteriorated. The towering, arrogant corporate titan instantly vanished, replaced entirely by a terrified, sweating child. The flawless, tailored navy suit suddenly looked far too large for his shaking frame. His breathing became incredibly rapid and shallow. He looked around the locked boardroom, seeing the absolute disgust on the faces of the investors and the cold detachment of his fleeing attorney. The walls of his glittering corporate fortress were rapidly closing in on him. The $15 million lifeline had just transformed into a heavy iron anchor that was going to drag him to the bottom of the ocean. He turned his desperate, panicked eyes toward his father. Nicholas lunged across the length of the mahogany table, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity or professional control. He fell to his knees right beside Harold's leather chair, grabbing the armrests with sweaty, trembling hands. He was hyperventilating, his dark eyes wide with an all-consuming terror. "Dad, please," Nicholas begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to fix this right now. Tell Gordon to draft a retroactive authorization. Tell them you gave me verbal permission to leverage the estate before the surgery. If you sign a retroactive release, we can legitimize the collateral transfer. We can say it was just a simple administrative oversight between family members. Please, Dad, they are going to lock me in federal prison. They are going to take away my entire life. I am your only son. You have to save me." Diana rushed over from the wet bar, her expensive shoes crunching loudly over the shattered ceramic pieces of her broken mug. She dropped to her knees right next to her husband, sobbing uncontrollably. She grabbed Harold's dark coat, pulling at the fabric with desperate, grasping fingers. "Please, Harold." Diana wept, her face completely ruined by tears and smeared makeup. "We will lose the house. We will lose the cars. We will lose absolutely everything. You cannot let them do this to us. Just sign a paper saying you approved the loan. Please just tell them it was a misunderstanding and that you always intended for Nicholas to have the property." Harold sat perfectly still in the deep leather chair. He did not pull his coat away from Diana's grasping hands. He did not flinch away from his son's sweaty, desperate face. He simply looked down at the two pathetic creatures kneeling on the floor. He felt absolutely no pity. He felt no residual parental warmth or protective instinct. The physical tumor had been successfully removed from his abdomen, but looking at Nicholas, Harold knew the true disease had just been permanently eradicated from his life. He remembered the cold, sterile air of the intensive care unit. He remembered Nicholas shoving the black pen into his trembling hand and threatening to lock him inside a state-run psychiatric ward to rot. He remembered the absolute cruelty in his son's eyes when he viewed his own father's survival as a massive financial inconvenience. Harold leaned forward slightly, gripping the carved wooden handle of his cane. His dark eyes were as cold and unforgiving as the stormy gray sky outside the towering glass windows. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a terrifying absolute clarity that cut straight through the frantic, pathetic sobbing. "You told me to accept reality, Nicholas," Harold said, his deep voice echoing with brutal, unyielding finality. "You told me that my life was a burden, and that saving me was a terrible return on investment. I am simply taking your excellent financial advice. I am protecting my assets from a highly toxic liability." Nicholas stared up at his father, his mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute horror. The realization struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. There was no mercy left in the old man. The father he had bullied and manipulated for decades, the man who had silently endured endless disrespect, was entirely gone. The heavy double-glass doors of the boardroom suddenly shook with a massive physical impact. Gordon Blake calmly walked over and disengaged the commercial deadbolt. The doors flew open, and a team of heavily armed federal agents flooded into the sprawling corporate room. The police officers wore dark tactical vests and moved with aggressive military precision. They immediately identified the primary suspect kneeling on the floor. Two massive officers grabbed Nicholas by the shoulders and hauled him violently to his feet. Nicholas screamed in pure terror as they twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed loudly through the silent room. "You are under arrest for massive securities fraud and federal wire tampering," the lead agent announced, his loud, authoritative voice drowning out Diana's hysterical screaming. "You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it." Nicholas was completely paralyzed by fear. His legs gave out entirely, and the officers had to physically drag him toward the doorway. He looked back over his shoulder, his face pale and completely broken. He watched his father sitting calmly at the end of the mahogany table, surrounded by the wreckage of the corporate empire. Harold did not look away. He watched his son being dragged out of the glittering room in steel chains. The natural order had been violently and perfectly restored. The silent reckoning was complete. Harold walked out of the towering glass headquarters, leaving the chaos of federal agents and shattered corporate illusions far behind him. The cold driving rain soaked his heavy dark coat, but he did not feel the chill. He hailed a passing yellow cab and climbed into the back seat, instructing the driver to take him to the old commercial district on the south side of the city. As the vehicle navigated through the congested wet streets, Harold looked out the blurred window. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the brutal confrontation in the boardroom was finally beginning to ebb. The sharp physical ache from his recent robotic surgery radiated across his abdomen, but he welcomed the pain. It was a visceral reminder that he was still alive and that the natural order of his family had been violently righted. He had just eradicated the toxic infection that was his son. Now he had one final vital task to complete. He had to restore the life of the only child who had actually proven her absolute loyalty and unconditional love. Valerie had sacrificed her entire existence to save him from the aggressive cancer. While Nicholas had plotted to let him die to secure a fraudulent $15 million corporate loan, Valerie had quietly liquidated her own future. She had surrendered the title to her only commercial delivery vehicle. She had drained the modest college savings account she had painstakingly built for her young son. She had mortgaged her beloved floral shop to the absolute limit just to cover the massive initial deposit for his highly experimental surgical procedure. She had done all of this without a single moment of hesitation and without asking for a single penny in return. Harold knew that her selfless actions had pushed her into a catastrophic financial abyss. He knew that the predatory commercial banks were already circling her fragile business, ready to tear it apart and leave her with absolutely nothing. The cab pulled up to the curb on a quiet, rain-swept street. Harold paid the driver and stepped out onto the wet pavement. He looked up at the faded green awning of the floral shop. The street was completely deserted, and the surrounding storefronts were brightly lit with neon signs welcoming the morning customers. But the shop belonging to Valerie was entirely dark. The large display windows were unlit, and the usual vibrant displays of fresh orchids and blooming hydrangeas had been removed. A heavy, suffocating silence surrounded the small brick building. Harold grasped the smooth wooden handle of his cane and walked slowly toward the glass entrance. He did not need to feign his weakness anymore, but his body was genuinely exhausted from the immense physical and emotional toll of the morning. He stopped just outside the front door and peered through the rain-streaked glass. The interior of the shop was dimly illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent bulb near the back office. The air inside looked cold and desolate. Harold watched as his daughter moved slowly behind the main wooden counter. Valerie was completely alone. She was surrounded by a mountain of flat, folded cardboard boxes and rolls of heavy packing tape. She was methodically wrapping fragile ceramic vases and glass terrariums in thick sheets of gray newspaper. Her shoulders slumped forward, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of total defeat. Harold watched her pause and reach up to wipe her face with the back of her dirt-stained sleeve. She was crying silently in the empty shop, mourning the death of her lifelong dream. Resting on the wooden counter right next to a half-empty roll of packing tape was a stark white legal document printed with bold red lettering. Even from the sidewalk, Harold recognized the distinct formatting of a commercial foreclosure notice. The bank had officially initiated the seizure of the property. Valerie was packing up her inventory because she was being legally evicted from the building she had rented and loved for over 15 years. She was preparing to lose her business and her livelihood, and she was doing it entirely alone so her sick father would not have to bear the guilt of her sacrifice. The sheer tragic beauty of her silent suffering brought a tight knot of genuine emotion to his throat. Harold pushed the heavy glass door open. The small brass bell hanging above the frame chimed with a clear, sharp ring that echoed through the hollow room. Valerie jumped violently, dropping a roll of packing tape onto the floor. She spun around and stared at the front entrance with wide, terrified eyes. When she saw her father standing on the wet welcome mat, her expression shifted from pure panic to profound confusion. She immediately turned her face away and frantically scrubbed the tears from her swollen cheeks. She forced a bright, artificial smile onto her face, attempting to project an illusion of perfect control. She walked quickly around the counter and scolded him, gently demanding to know the reason he was wandering out of his hospital bed in the freezing rain. She told him he was supposed to be recovering from his surgery and that he needed to go back immediately before he ruined his fresh stitches. Harold did not answer her desperate barrage of worried statements. He walked slowly across the room, inhaling the lingering scent of damp earth and crushed rose petals that permanently permeated the wooden floorboards. He stopped directly in front of the main counter and looked down at the bright red foreclosure notice. Valerie rushed forward and tried to snatch the legal document away, but Harold placed his large, heavy hand firmly over the paper. He stopped her frantic movement completely. He looked deep into her red, swollen eyes, seeing the absolute exhaustion and the raw, terrifying fear hiding just beneath her brave facade. He told her she did not need to hide the truth from him anymore. He told her he knew exactly what she had sacrificed to pay for his medical procedure and that he knew the commercial bank was coming to seize the shop. Valerie collapsed against the edge of the wooden counter. The artificial smile vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of pure, devastating grief. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. She wept for her lost business and her uncertain future. She confessed that she was completely ruined and that she had absolutely no idea how she was going to feed her son or put a roof over their heads. She apologized repeatedly, telling her father she was a failure for losing the shop. She said she had tried to negotiate with the commercial landlord, but they refused to grant her a single day of leniency. The property was scheduled for public auction by the end of the month, and she had to vacate the premises by Friday. Harold listened to her painful confession with infinite patience. He waited until her heavy sobs began to subside. He reached inside the deep breast pocket of his dark wool coat. He did not pull out a tissue or offer empty words of parental comfort. Instead, he extracted a crisp, pristine, rectangular document. It was a certified bank cashier check drawn directly from the immense liquid reserves of his impenetrable blind trust. He placed the heavy textured paper face up on the counter, right over the red foreclosure notice. Valerie slowly lowered her hands and looked down at the document. She blinked her tear-filled eyes, struggling to process the string of numbers printed across the center line. The check was made out directly to her personal business account in the exact amount of $1,500,000. Before Valerie could even draw a breath to speak, Harold reached back into his coat pocket. He pulled out a thick legal dossier bound in dark blue leather. He opened the heavy cover and extracted a pristine notarized property deed. He placed the official document right next to the massive cashier check. He told his daughter to look closely at the name printed on the bottom of the deed. Valerie leaned forward, trembling violently. She read the legal text and gasped loudly. The document was the absolute unencumbered deed to the entire commercial building that housed her floral business. Harold explained that he had quietly purchased the entire brick structure through a proxy holding company 3 days ago. He had legally transferred the absolute ownership of the building directly into her name. Harold looked into the stunned, tearful eyes of his daughter. He told her she was never going to be evicted because she was now the sole legal landlord of the entire property. He told her the $1.5 million was a minor fraction of the actual inheritance she truly deserved. He explained that she would never have to worry about a bank, a loan, or a medical bill for the rest of her natural life. He told her that her brother Nicholas was currently sitting in a federal holding cell for massive corporate fraud, and that the toxic poison had finally been removed from their family. Valerie stared at the documents and then threw her arms around the neck of her father, weeping tears of pure, absolute salvation. Harold held his daughter tightly, standing tall and strong amidst the cardboard boxes. The long, painful war was finally over, and the foundation of their new life was perfectly secure. Valerie stood completely frozen behind the wooden counter, staring down at the heavy bank paper resting on the polished surface. The string of zeros printed across the cashier check blurred together through her warm tears, forming an impossible mathematical sequence. $1,500,000. She slowly shifted her gaze from the massive check to the notarized property deed bearing her own name in bold black ink. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. She tried to form words, but her voice failed her, completely trapped behind a thick wall of absolute shock. She looked up at her father, searching his weathered face for a logical explanation. Harold stood tall amidst the scattered cardboard boxes and the cold, empty shelves of the dying floral shop. He did not look like the frail, dying man who had begged for her help just weeks ago. The pathetic trembling in his hands was gone. The sickly slump of his shoulders had completely vanished. He radiated a calm, towering strength that completely anchored the chaotic dark room. Harold spoke softly, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of the desolate store. He told Valerie that she needed to understand the absolute truth about their family history. He explained that decades ago he had clearly recognized the dangerous path his son was walking. Nicholas was consumed by a toxic, reckless greed that threatened to destroy everything Harold had spent his entire life building. Harold knew he could not leave his hard-earned legacy unprotected against a predator who shared his own blood, so he created a massive financial illusion. He allowed Nicholas to believe that his entire net worth was tied up in the primary residential estate and a few minor commercial properties scattered around the city. But that was a carefully constructed corporate lie designed to distract a greedy mind. Harold took a slow, deliberate step toward the wooden counter. He revealed that for over 30 years he had been quietly acquiring massive commercial logistics hubs and highly lucrative shipping ports across the entire eastern seaboard. He had built a highly profitable holding company from the ground up and funneled every single asset into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. His actual net worth was staggering, completely hidden from public records and totally insulated from his son's predatory grasp. Valerie listened in absolute disbelief as her father methodically dismantled the false reality of their entire lives. She had grown up firmly believing they were a simple middle-class family, constantly struggling to maintain a modest, quiet existence. She had never known she was the daughter of a silent corporate titan. Harold reached across the counter and placed his large, warm hands gently over her trembling fingers. He told her that hiding the immense wealth was the only legitimate way to test the true character of his children. He needed to know exactly who would stand by him when the money supposedly ran dry and the medical bills began to pile up. When the aggressive cancer diagnosis arrived last month, Harold saw the perfect, agonizing opportunity to execute his final, ultimate test. He went to his son first, begging for the necessary funds to cover the highly experimental robotic surgery. Nicholas had coldly and instantly refused, citing temporary cash flow problems, while simultaneously orchestrating a massive corporate fraud behind his father's back. Nicholas had looked his own father directly in the eyes and actively chose to let him die just to accelerate his inheritance. Harold looked at his daughter, and his dark eyes softened with a profound, genuine gratitude that transcended words. He told Valerie that she had been his absolute salvation. When he came to her small shop with nothing but a desperate, pathetic plea for his life, she did not hesitate for a single solitary second. She did not ask for a return on her investment or demand a controlling stake in his personal estate. Harold stated the exact number with heavy emotional reverence: $17,000. He spoke the figure slowly, letting the immense weight of her sacrifice fill the quiet, empty room. He recounted every single agonizing detail of her struggle. He knew she had immediately liquidated her entire commercial delivery fleet, selling the trucks for a fraction of their actual value just to get the cash quickly. He knew she had completely drained the modest college savings account she had painstakingly built for her young son over the past 10 years. He knew she had mortgaged her beloved floral business to the absolute breaking point, taking on predatory loans with crushing interest rates. She gave up $17,000 and her entire financial future just to give her sick father a fighting chance to live. She had willingly stepped into a devastating abyss of debt simply because she loved him. Harold reached into the deep inside pocket of his wet, dark coat one final time. He produced a single-bound legal contract printed on thick premium paper. He slid it slowly across the wooden counter, placing it right next to the property deed and the massive cashier check. He explained that the document was an official binding transfer of authority. He was officially and permanently naming Valerie as the sole managing executor and the singular legal beneficiary of his entire multi-million-dollar logistics portfolio. The massive blind trust and all of its generating income belonged entirely to her now. Harold stated with terrifying clarity that Nicholas and Diana were permanently legally exiled from the family fortune. They were completely severed from the bloodline and would never touch a single cent of his legacy. He told Valerie that her brother was currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive securities fraud, and that the toxic poison had finally been permanently removed from their family tree. Valerie looked down at the 3 life-changing documents resting on her worn wooden counter. She felt the crushing, suffocating weight of her massive debts instantly evaporate into thin air. The terrifying, paralyzing fear of losing her home and failing her young son washed away completely, leaving behind a profound, radiant peace. The relentless panic that had gripped her chest for weeks finally released its brutal hold. She collapsed forward, weeping openly and resting her head gently against her father's broad chest. Harold wrapped his strong arms around his daughter, holding her tightly, while the cold rain beat against the dark glass windows of the shop. The long, painful war was finally over. The true legacy of their family was perfectly secure in the hands of the only child who actually possessed the moral courage to deserve it. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass doors of the corporate boardroom slammed shut on a fraudulent empire. The brutal winter storms have long since surrendered to a bright and vibrant spring. Harold sits quietly at a small wrought iron table situated perfectly near the massive front windows of the newly expanded floral shop. The physical transformation in his body is absolute and undeniable. The gray pallor of impending death has been entirely replaced by the warm, healthy flush of total recovery. He breathes deeply and evenly, drawing in the rich, heavy scent of blooming jasmine and damp potting soil. He does not need a wooden cane anymore. His posture is tall and unbroken, reflecting the profound internal peace that comes from surviving a fatal betrayal. The floral shop itself has transformed into a thriving, bustling sanctuary of commerce and life. Valerie used the capital from the blind trust to knock down the dividing walls of the adjacent vacant storefronts. She expanded her operation across the entire ground floor of the commercial building she now legally owns. Customers weave constantly through the wide aisles carrying large bundles of fresh orchids and heavy ceramic pots. The cash register chimes continuously, playing a steady, rhythmic melody of legitimate, honest success. Harold watches his daughter move behind the long, polished wooden counter. She is no longer the terrified, weeping woman crushed under the weight of predatory debt. Valerie radiates a quiet, commanding authority. She directs her new staff with grace and manages the massive daily inventory with effortless precision. She is the true and rightful heir to the legacy he built from absolutely nothing. Harold takes a slow sip of his black coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle deep in his chest. He requires absolutely nothing more from this world. He has completely eradicated the toxic infection that once threatened to consume his entire bloodline. He watches a young mother purchase a bright bouquet of yellow sunflowers from Valerie. The simple transaction represents exactly what Harold sacrificed his entire life to protect. It represents honest labor and fundamental human decency. He feels a deep, profound satisfaction, knowing that his vast, hidden wealth is finally serving its true intended purpose. The millions of dollars locked inside the irrevocable blind trust are no longer a target for greedy predators. They are a permanent, impenetrable shield wrapped securely around Valerie and her young son. The peaceful sanctuary of the floral shop is suddenly interrupted by a harsh, sharp sound, A small black burner phone rests flat on the wrought iron table right next to Harold's coffee cup. It vibrates violently against the metal surface, emitting a loud, jarring electronic ringtone. The sudden noise is an ugly mechanical intrusion into the bright, warm space. Harold does not jump or react with any surprise. He slowly lowers his coffee cup, placing it carefully onto a small ceramic saucer. He stares down at the small black device. The screen illuminates with a harsh blue light, displaying a long, complex string of numbers. It is not a local caller identification code. It is a highly specific routing sequence indicating an incoming institutional call. Harold picks up the vibrating phone with a perfectly steady hand. He presses the green acceptance button and raises the plastic device to his ear. He does not say a single word. He simply breathes evenly and waits for the digital connection to establish itself across the state lines. A cold, synthetic, automated voice suddenly fills the tiny speaker. The robotic voice announces that this is a prepaid collect call originating from a federal penitentiary holding facility. The machine demands that the recipient press 1 to accept the charges or press 2 to immediately disconnect the line. The automated system then patches through a brief 3-second audio recording, identifying the specific inmate attempting to make the call. The voice that comes through the speaker is high-pitched, ragged, and completely destroyed by pure, unadulterated terror. It is Nicholas. He is weeping uncontrollably, begging his father to pick up the line. He is screaming that he desperately needs bail money to get out of the maximum security holding block. Nicholas sounds exactly like a cornered, terrified animal stripped of all his tailored suits and his towering corporate arrogance. He is drowning in the brutal reality of his own catastrophic decisions, facing decades behind thick iron bars for massive securities fraud and federal wire tampering. The $15 million lie has finally crushed him into absolute dust. Harold can hear the chaotic background noise of the federal prison behind his son's desperate sobbing. He hears the harsh metallic slamming of heavy iron doors and the distant shouting of violent inmates. He listens to the pathetic, broken pleading of his only son. He feels absolutely no pity. He feels no trace of parental guilt or lingering sorrow. He remembers the cold, dark intensive care unit. He remembers Nicholas standing over his hospital bed, demanding that he sign away his entire life while simultaneously planning to lock him inside a state-run psychiatric ward. He remembers the sheer ruthless entitlement that drove Nicholas to sacrifice his own father's life for a fraudulent commercial loan. The man crying on the other end of the telephone line is not his child. He is simply a failed predator caught firmly in a trap of his own making. The automated voice returns to the speaker, repeating the strict mechanical instructions. It tells Harold to press 1 to accept the charges and speak to the federal inmate. It tells him to press 2 to decline and terminate the connection forever. Harold looks across the bright floral shop, watching Valerie laugh warmly as she hands a wrapped bouquet to a smiling customer. The contrast between the vibrant, beautiful life unfolding inside the shop and the dark, miserable terror radiating from the telephone speaker is absolute and complete. Harold does not utter a single syllable. He does not offer any final words of condemnation or impart any grand moral lesson to the sobbing prisoner on the line. He pulls the phone away from his ear and looks down at the glowing digital screen. He extends his right index finger and firmly presses the red decline button. The call instantly drops, severing the connection with a sharp, final click. Harold opens the internal settings of the burner phone and navigates directly to the recent call log. He selects the institutional routing number and permanently blocks it, ensuring that the federal penitentiary can never reach this device again. He places the silent black phone face down on the table. He reaches out and picks up his ceramic cup, taking another slow, deliberate sip of his dark coffee. The harsh mechanical intrusion is completely gone, replaced once again by the soft, pleasant sounds of his daughter's thriving business. The brutal storm of deception and betrayal has finally passed, leaving behind a clean, unobstructed horizon. Harold watches the bright spring sunlight stream through the massive glass windows, illuminating the vibrant green leaves and the colorful blooming flowers. The quiet stoic patriarch has completely inverted the power dynamic and neutralized the ultimate threat. The silent reckoning is finally over. The natural order is permanently restored. The narrative demonstrates that true wealth is not measured by the accumulation of capital, but by the strength of one's moral character and the depth of their loyalty. Greed and deception may construct an illusion of absolute power, but that foundation is incredibly fragile and destined to collapse. When a person ruthlessly sacrifices their own family for personal gain, they inevitably engineer their own total destruction. The story reveals that authentic power lies in infinite patience, meticulous calculation, and the quiet, unyielding strength required to walk away from those who mistake kindness for weakness. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know how you would handle such a profound betrayal from your own bloodline.